I was reborn 1 month before my wife and daughter died. Johnson, stop hitting me, please. The familiar cry in my ear shocked me. My wife Grace was holding Angela, hiding in the corner, trembling and looking at me. The moment I tried to open my eyes, my wife was obviously frightened. Johnson, please don't hit us. I will earn enough money for drinking tomorrow before the typhoon. Please let us, mother and daughter, go. Grace's voice trembled, and my heart ached. The wooden bed, the window paper, the enamel water tank, everything in front of me was so real that it suffocated me. This was the home of my youth. The face in the mirror looked 50 years younger, but the blue lotus eyes did not belong to the past. Grace? Angela? I choked and called out these two names. My body was shaking violently, but I couldn't control myself and rushed forward to get closer to them. Grace shuddered and quickly knelt down to protect Angela. Johnson, please don't hit Angela. You almost broke her hand yesterday. If you want to hit someone, hit me. Angela also sobbed and said, Dad, Angela was wrong. Angela will earn enough money to buy wine for Dad tomorrow. Dad, please don't hit Mom. I felt as if my chest was slashed by a sharp blade, and it hurt so much that I couldn't breathe. They were terrified and trembling all over. Grace, Angela. Tears blur my vision. I hugged them tightly, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was wrong. Grace stared at me in disbelief. Angela raised her head timidly and whispered, Don't be sad, Dad. Angela can make money. Tomorrow she can make a lot of money and buy wine for Dad. I hugged her tighter. My throat choked with sobs, and I couldn't speak. No, Angela. Daddy will never hit you again. Never again. Outside the door, Daniel was hiding in the crack of the door and peeking in. I was very familiar with his appearance. In the previous life, tonight, he had secretly seen Grace changing her clothes. Daniel's family tried to ruin Grace's life under the guise of marrying her. 50 years ago, I was a selfish loser who pushed my wife and daughter into a desperate situation. From then on, all the tragedies began. But now, since God has allowed me to live again in this life, anyone who dares to bully them will be paid with blood. Angela's hand was so red and swollen that I felt so distressed. I gently lifted her hand and said in a low but sincere voice, Angela, Daddy was wrong. From today on, I will never hit you and Mommy again. Daddy will earn money to support the family, okay? Hearing what I said, Angela nodded innocently and said in a baby voice, Okay, Angela believes in Daddy. Angela is an adult now. She can help Daddy share the burden. Grace didn't say much, just turned her head away. Her silence made me feel even more guilty, because I knew she had long been numb to my apology. I had submitted countless confessions and letters of repentance at home and to the village chief, but I had disappointed her time and again. This time, I had to let her see my determination. Grace, I'm going to get Angela a doctor and bring back some delicious food. I touched Angela's little head and asked, Angela, what do you want to eat? Daddy will buy it for you. Wo too. Angela wants to eat with too. Angela's eyes sparkled, and she answered seriously and expectantly. At that moment, my heart was both bitter and warm. Grace advised, Johnson, it's late. The doctor is off work, and the grain store is closed. Besides, I saw a doctor at the factory today, and there are no broken bones, so just apply some medicine. I shook my head and said in a firm tone, Grace, don't worry, I will solve it. I can't let you suffer anymore. After that, I turned and walked out the door. As soon as she walked out of the hospital gate, she saw Daniel standing stealthily in the yard, glancing into the house from time to time, staring at Grace's back and scrupulously. I suddenly felt murderous intent. In my previous life, his dirty deeds had already disgusted me to the extreme. If it weren't for him, Grace wouldn't have encountered those unbearable things. I pretended to walk away, but suddenly turned back, just in time to catch him peeking again. I raised my hand and slapped him directly in the face. Oh, why did you hit me? Daniel stumbled back, covered his face, and glared at me. I sneered and slapped him again. Daniel, I know all the dirty things you have done. If you dare to look at Grace again, I will dig out your eyes. He was so scared that he covered his face and begged for mercy. Before Daniel could run back home, I kicked him and knocked him to the ground. Before he could get up, I slapped him twice. Daniel, don't think I don't know what you are thinking. If you dare to glance at Grace again, I will dig your eyes out. I warned coldly. Daniel covered his face, shaking with fear, and stammered for mercy. I know. I won't dare to do it again. Don't hit me. After that, he crawled back home, I watched him go into the house, the anger in my heart still not subsided. In the last life, this guy's dirty mind caused Grace to suffer humiliation. This life, I will never let him have any chance again. Inside the house, Daniel covered his face with his hands, and the red and swollen marks of the slap were visible between his fingers. He shouted angrily, "Mom, Johnson hit me. Look how hard he hit me." Daniel's mother came over and looked at his face distressfully. She turned to Daniel's father and shouted, "He lives in the same yard as us. How could he bully others like this? And he beat him so hard." Daniel's father had a gloomy face. He threw down his steamed bread, put on his coat, and was about to go out. Does Johnson think he has no law because he has so many brothers? Isn't it natural for men to like looking at women? I'm going to find the village chief and punish him. Daniel's mother and Daniel quickly try to persuade him. What if we run into Johnson now? We can't beat him. Let's go tomorrow. Daniel's father hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, let's go to the village chief tomorrow morning and report him. Didn't they say recently that they want to rectify the social atmosphere? Johnson is the leader of the gangsters in the village, and he must be dealt with first. Daniel's mother looked at her son's face and asked again, "Did you hear anything useful today? Anything that can help us catch him?" Daniel thought about it and said proudly, "Angela's finger seems to have been broken by him. Does this count?" Daniel's mother sneered. "Ha, this is not the first time he abuses his wife and children. A dog will always eat shit. Let's report him tomorrow. It will work." When mentioning Grace, Daniel's eyes flashed with greed, but he sighed hypocritically. Sister Grace is really pitiful. Such a good woman has to deal with a bastard like Johnson. Daniel's father also nodded in agreement. If such a good woman came into our family and became our daughter-in-law, we would be willing to give her steamed bread to eat. Daniel's mother snorted coldly. You guys are really deceived by her illusion. Do you know what her reputation is in the factory? I heard that the factory director gave her underwear yesterday. Daniel's father and Daniel were stunned. Daniel's mother raised her lips and whispered, "She is a slut. I didn't want to get involved in this matter, but today her man beat my son, so I have to make them pay the price." She looked grimly in the direction of Grace's house, with a cold light in her eyes. All this can't wait any longer. When the neighbors returned to the courtyard one after another, I had already left, leaving only Grace and Angela at home. The courtyard was bustling with people, but I couldn't let go of them. Angela tactfully poured the rest of my wine into the wine jar, which she had bought with the money she had saved for a year. As long as there was wine in the house, they would not be beaten. Afterwards, she crawled under the bed, took out my stinky socks, picked up a basin of water, and sat at the door with Grace to wash clothes. Her little hands were so red and swollen that she pulled them back in pain after washing twice. Grace was so distressed that she took the socks from Angela and washed them with her own clothes. Seeing them like this, I felt an indescribable pain in my chest. "Mom," Angela called in a low voice, with a little grievance in her tone. Grace responded softly. "What's wrong, Angela?" She looked up at Angela while washing clothes. "Does Dad still hate Angela? Will he chase Angela away?" Angela lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Today is the last day. Angela doesn't want to leave." Hearing this, Grace sighed softly, put down the clothes in her hands, and comforted her. "Silly child, Daddy only said drunken words. You will forget them when you wake up. Don't cry. Didn't Daddy say he would buy you something to eat?" Angela uttered a but dragged a small sack out of the house and said seriously, "I'm going to pick up some firewood. As long as I can save enough money for the wine, Dad will not abandon Angela." Grace looked at her little figure from behind, feeling a pang of sadness in her heart. This child only had me in her eyes, but in the past I always beat her, scolded her, and told her to get out of the house. By the time Grace realized what was happening, Angela had already left the hospital. Her heart tightened, and she hurriedly got up to chase after her. But as soon as she reached the door, she was stopped by Daniel's mother and her men. "Bitch, where do you want to go?" Daniel's mother pushed Grace to the ground and said viciously, "We are going to expose you as a bitch at the whole school meeting. You are not allowed to go anywhere." Grace fell to the ground. Her hands were bruised, but she didn't care about the pain. She only thought about Angela, crying anxiously. "Let me find Angela. It's dark. It's not safe outside, please. It's good that Angela is not here." Daniel's mother sneered, because the child might see it. It would be embarrassing in front of her. She turned her head and winked at the onlookers, and the crowd behind her began to get restless. Grace stood up and tried to rush out, but was stopped. She was so anxious that she shouted, "Angela, Come back soon. Her voice was choked with sobs and tears in her eyes, and she could hardly stand. Her resistance angered Daniel's mother, and several women around her began to strip her clothes off, and even a few men stretched out their dirty hands, their eyes full of dirty desires. Don't touch me, please. Grace struggled desperately, crying, I'm pregnant. I can't do this. Please let me go. Daniel's mother sneered. Pregnant? Who knows which wild man's child it is? She said sinisterly. Carry it into the house and see who is capable of teaching you a lesson. The courtyard was full of depression and distortion at this time. On the other side, I was passing by Daniel to buy something. When the river water just flooded over my calves, the world in front of me suddenly changed. The humid air disappeared, and I came to a vast space. An intelligent voice came. Welcome to the Qinglian space. You can build here according to your wishes. I was silent for a moment, and I planned a preliminary plan to restore the farm in my mind. I unlocked the chicken farm, checked in, built a broiler house, and put black chickens into production, and planned to make black chicken soup for Grace and Angela in the future. I returned to the river again, carrying 3 big fat chickens. I heard the sound of chickens crowing, and not far away, I heard Angela crying. Will Dad come to save Angela? The voice was trembling and weak. Angela, who was curled up in a ball, with sticky saliva flowing from the corners of their mouths. My chest suddenly tightened and anger instantly ignited. Angela, Dad is here. Ah, the barking of wild dogs echoed in the alley, and several ferocious wild dogs surrounded Angela in a corner. She was holding a bag of firewood, and the scratches on her ankles were bleeding. Angela was so scared that she blocked her ears and begged in a trembling voice. Big yellow dogs, I don't have much meat. Please let me go. But her plea made the wild dogs bark even louder. A wild dog in front of them was approaching step by step, baring its teeth and emitting a foul smell. Angela hid the firewood behind her, closed her eyes, and curled up into a ball. Suddenly, a figure jumped up from the high wall and rushed over following the crying sound. I looked at Angela not far away, and the wild dogs were so close that my anger was instantly ignited. Ouch! The moment the wild dog pounced on Angela, I flew and kicked it, sending it flying more than 10 meters away. The other 3 wild dogs growled at me, and I slowly turned around, staring at them with my blue eyes. The wild dogs fled in panic with their tails between their legs, not even daring to turn their heads. I walked to the corner, squatted down, and called softly, Angela, it's Daddy. Angela shouted in fear, Don't bite me. After a while, she slowly opened her eyes, saw me, threw herself into my arms, and sobbed softly, Dad. Holding her in my arms, my eyes fell on the bag on the ground, which was full of firewood. My heart seemed to be clenched by something. This child was still saving money for my wine at this late hour. Dad, Angela has saved up a lot of firewood, which could be exchanged for money for wine soon. So, Dad, please don't chase Angela away, okay? Angela's little hands were full of barbs, but she didn't say a word. My nose was sore. I hugged Angela tightly in my arms and whispered, Dad will not drive Angela away. Dad will always accompany Angela to grow up. Really? Angela looked up in surprise. Then let's make a pinky promise. I smiled and held her hand. Pinky promise for 100 years, no change. Looking at the scratches on Angela's ankle, my heart tightened. Rabies vaccine is expensive in the village, but I have to take her to get vaccinated without taking any risks. Dad, please go back and save Mom. Angela suddenly became nervous and said with tears in her eyes, They are bullying Mom and stripping her clothes. Angela is here to find Dad and go home. My head buzzed, and I felt a chill from head to toe. Grace was in danger. I hugged Angela tightly and ran home quickly, anger boiling in my chest. Today, whoever dares to touch Grace will pay the price. Just as I reached the other side, I saw a familiar figure standing by the turbulent river. She was carrying a medicine box, hesitating and unable to cross the river. Stella. I recognized her, but a picture flashed through my mind. At this time in her previous life, she was on a night visit and accidentally fell into the water, never to return. Do you want to cross the river? I asked in a deep voice. She nodded and said hesitantly, Yes, but the river is too fast. Let me wait. Without waiting for her to respond, I carried her up and crossed the turbulent river directly. What are you doing? She exclaimed. After I put her down, she looked at me blankly, as if she didn't understand how I could have so much strength. I checked the wound on Angela's ankle and took a deep breath. Stella, Angela was scratched by a wild dog. Please bring the rabies vaccine to my house. I have to go back quickly. She noticed that I looked a little strange and nodded in agreement. Okay, I'll take the vaccine over. She gently lifted Angela's little hand and said softly, Angela, be good. See you later. Come home with Daddy. I reminded her, Stella, when you go, find Michael and ask him to bring some brothers over. She nodded and hurried away with the medicine box on her back, while I quickly ran home holding Angela. The gate of the courtyard was closed. Through the window, I saw that the house was crowded with people. Grace was hiding in the corner, holding a kitchen knife to her neck, her face full of fear. Don't come over here. If you come over again, I will commit suicide. Grace's voice was trembling so badly that even the blade was shaking, and blood was oozing from her neck. Daniel's face was full of ferocity, and he was about to pounce, but was pulled back by Daniel's mother. The male neighbors looked at each other, and Daniel's mother said coldly, Let's go. She's lucky this time. The people in the room gradually dispersed, but they took away the pieces of clothing on the ground. Daniel even took away the piece of cloth from Grace's thigh. Before leaving, he revealed an obscene sneer. Daniel's mother leaned close to Grace's ear and whispered, Bitch, you better keep your mouth shut. Don't let me find the underwear that Director Yang gave you. If Johnson knew about it, would you still be able to keep the baby in your belly? Pah! She slapped Grace hard, then left with a sneer. Grace collapsed on the ground, trembling all over, tears rolling down her cheeks. Not far away, Aunt Yu squatted beside her and sighed. Grace, women, you have to accept your fate. If you marry Johnson, you won't have a good life in this life. Grace replied, crying, I really tried. I really wanted to live a good life. But her voice became weaker and weaker, and was gradually replaced by suppressed sobs. Just then, I rushed to the gate of the courtyard holding Angela. The air was filled with the smell of damp blood. All the way to the house, Grace's clothing was scattered on the ground, and with every step I took, the burden on my heart increased. Bright red blood was flowing out of the crack of the door. I took a deep breath and kicked the door open. Grace, I'm back to save you. The scene in front of me made me dizzy. The bloodstains on the floor extended to the bed, just like the illusion I had just had. I quickly scanned the room, but I didn't see Grace. Just then, a faint voice came from the corner. Johnson, Angela? Grace curled up in the corner, with bright red handprints on her face, blood at the corners of her mouth and neck. Her clothes were tattered, and she was holding a bloody kitchen knife in her hand. Seeing that she was still alive, my body suddenly relaxed, but cold sweat had already soaked my whole body. Angela jumped out of my arms and threw herself into Grace's arms, shouting excitedly, Mom! Dad brought Angela back to save Mom. Grace checked the wound on Angela's ankle, her eyes full of heartache. I comforted her. Don't worry, Stella will be here soon with the rabies vaccine. She looked up at me, her voice full of fatigue. Why are you sweating so much? Angela rushed to answer. Mom, Dad was crying just now. Dad is very worried about you, and he loves you very much. Her childish tone made Grace's eyes flash with a complicated look. I'm fine, you guys take a rest. I'll go cook. Grace whispered, put Angela down, picked up the kitchen knife on the ground, turned and walked towards the kitchen. I held her hand and said in a low voice, Did Daniel's family bully you? My eyes fell on the handprints on her face, the blood at the corners of her mouth, and the wound on her neck. The anger in my heart was almost out of control. She lowered her head, her eyes dodging, and said softly, No, I did it accidentally. Johnson, I marry you, and I am yours. No matter what you hear, I have never done anything to let you down. Her words made my chest feel even tighter, and looking at her shaking hands and pale face, I couldn't help but clench my hands. She was obviously hiding something, and I had already guessed the truth. I suppressed my anger and said to Angela, Angela, you stay at home with Mom. Dad is going out for a while. No matter what happens outside, don't come out. Angela nodded obediently. Okay, Angela will take good care of Mom. After closing the door, I could no longer suppress my murderous intent, and a raging rage surged from my body. At this moment, Aunt Yu ran over from next door and hurriedly grabbed me. Johnson, don't hit Grace. She's pregnant. She changed the subject and whispered. When Daniel's mother brought people to bully Grace, I spoke up for her. I stopped those men from doing anything they wanted to do. There's nothing else to do. What? My voice was hoarse, and my eyes were bloodshot. The killing intent in my body had reached its peak. I stared at the direction of Daniel's house not far away and walked towards it with heavy steps. I stood outside the window of Daniel's house and saw through the curtains that they were gathered together, with peanuts and water on the table, and were enthusiastically discussing the results of bullying Grace. Grace is a slut. That's been determined long ago. Even though we didn't succeed today, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future. Daniel's mother said grimly, and the male neighbors agreed with her while laughing. The original plan was to do it again after Johnson left on the 5th. Daniel's mother's voice was harsh, and the veins on my forehead throbbed, and I could no longer suppress my murderous intent. In the shadow of the curtains, my eyes glowed green, staring at everyone in the room. When Daniel's mother noticed, she looked out the window with a horrified look on her face. "What is that?" They drew aside the curtains, and the room was instantly silent. I stood outside the window, staring at them coldly, my voice low and suppressed. "You are the ones who bullied my wife." I smashed the window with my fist, got into the house, and blocked the door with a cabinet. Daniel's family and neighbors were so scared that they huddled in their chairs, their faces pale. Daniel's mother looked at me and couldn't speak clearly. Her previous arrogance was gone. Cold sweat broke out on her body, and her face was paler than the moonlight outside the window. Daniel clutched the pieces of Grace as clothes, his hands shaking violently. Lu Dabiao tried to throw a handful of peanuts and rushed out of the room, but I kicked him back and he fell into the crowd. I glanced at the people in the room and said in a low but murderous voice, "Today, you can't go anywhere." Every word I said was like a knife, cutting them into fear. After I kicked Lu Dabiao back into the crowd, his face turned pale. He pulled Daniel's mother and whispered, "Something is wrong. Let's find a way to escape." His tone was full of fear. Daniel's mother sneered and helped Lu Dabiao up. She looked around and whispered to the neighbors, "There are more than 20 of us here. Are you afraid that we can't beat Johnson? If we catch him and send him to the police station, we can get meritorious service." The male neighbors looked at each other with hesitation and helplessness on their faces. Daniel's mother continued to incite. "If you don't do anything, you'll just wait for him to deal with you? If you destroy him, Grace will be at your mercy in the future." As soon as I finished speaking, Daniel rushed towards me with a stool in his hand, roaring, "If I knock you down, I will marry Sister Grace. I will treat her well for the rest of my life." Hearing this, my murderous intent suddenly erupted. I raised my hand and smashed the stool in his hand with a punch, then grabbed his wrist and sneered, "Is this how you treat her? Bringing people to bully her?" After saying that, I twisted his arm and broke it. "Ah!" Daniel knelt on the ground, howling heartbreakingly. Seeing this, Daniel's father rushed over with a peanut plate in his hand. "I will fight you." The men in the room also rushed over. Fists flew out, and I quickly dealt with every one of them who rushed towards me. Bang, bang, bang. 8 men were hit hard in the eye sockets by me, and they fell to the ground wailing, covering their bleeding eyes. I looked at them coldly and whispered, "Don't you like watching? I'll let you see enough." Then I turned around and grabbed Daniel's mother, who was trying to escape from the window, pulled her back, and slapped her hard in the face. Daniel's mother opened her mouth to beg for mercy. I sneered and said, "Did you forgive Grace when she begged you?" After that, I lifted her body and smashed her directly out of the window. The sound of broken glass echoed in the yard. Daniel's mother rolled to the center of the yard, her face covered in blood, and she screamed indistinctly, "On my face, my tongue." I stood at the door, coldly guarding Grace and Angela. Soon, more than 20 men with iron bars rushed into the yard. Daniel's mother screamed, "Kill him, strip Grace naked, and send her to your house." The group of men raised their weapons and rushed towards me frantically. The next second, a green light pierced the air, and time seemed to stand still. 24 people flew backwards, wailing on the ground, blood spurting from their mouths, and it was impossible to see what was happening. Lu Dabiao got up from the ground and looked at the tragic scene in front of him with horror. Before he ran out of the yard, a knife was put on his neck, and the blade was so cold that his scalp numbed. Outside the courtyard gate, a young man with a scar on his face and a woman carrying a medicine box on her back appeared in front of everyone. Behind them stood a group of ferocious-looking men, and the team stretched to the end of the alley. I glanced at them calmly and said in a cold tone, "Tonight, no one can escape from here unscathed." Chapter 9. Michael rushed into the courtyard with his brothers, followed by Stella carrying a medicine box. An aunt also walked out of the house. accusing the neighbors who bullied Grace. I quietly stood at the door, watching all this with cold eyes. Michael held two knives on the necks of Lu Dabiao and Daniel's mother. He narrowed his eyes and stared at Lu Dabiao with a chill in his tone. Lu Dabiao, are you tired of living? The blade lightly scratched the skin, and blood oozed out along the blade. Lu Dabiao was so frightened that he was shaking. He quickly explained, Brother Dao, I didn't know Ding was your woman. This was all Daniel's mother who bewitched me. She was the one who ordered me to bully Grace. Hearing this, Daniel's mother was about to open her mouth to refute, but Michael kicked her to the middle of the yard, and she rolled on the ground in pain. At this time, footsteps came from outside the door. Emma, who had short hair, rushed in with a group of women. She fixed her eyes on Lu Dabiao, her eyes full of anger. Touching my sister's butt? Bullying my sister-in-law? Lu Dabiao, if I don't cripple you today, I'll take your fucking last name. Pa! Pa! Emma stepped forward and slapped Lu Dabiao 6 times, then kicked him to Daniel's mother. She looked around and stared coldly at Daniel's mother and other middle-aged women. You want to strip my sister-in-law's clothes, right? Today I will let you taste the feeling of having your clothes stripped. At her command, the women she brought rushed forward and tore the clothes of Daniel's mother and others into pieces. They covered their bodies in shame and finally understood Grace's despair at that time. Stella said coldly, Are you afraid of being embarrassed? Grace is pregnant. How can you bear to bully her? You should have some conscience. Daniel's mother lowered her head, her face flushed, feeling ashamed. I sat on a chair brought from the courtyard. The atmosphere in the courtyard was as cold as winter. Michael reported the situation in the county in a low voice, but I kept my eyes on Daniel lying on the ground. You're the one who's going to marry Grace, right? My voice was as cold as ice, and Daniel shuddered with every word. He held his broken hand, with a piece of Grace's clothes sticking out of his trouser pocket. Chapter 10. I sat on the chair, quietly watching Daniel being interrogated by Michael with a knife at his fingertips. His face was pale, his whole body was shaking with pain. His eyes dodged everywhere, like a mouse with nowhere to escape. Brother Johnson, Brother Dao, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Daniel begged for mercy again and again, but the scraps of Grace's clothes that fell out of my trouser pocket made my face gloomy instantly. Michael raised his hand and put a knife on Daniel's neck, sneering. Go on. What did you do wrong? Explain in detail. Daniel was so scared that his voice trembled, but he still argued. I didn't take it. Dabiao and the others forced it on me. Hearing this, Lu Dabiao exploded. Bullshit. You're the one who took the most clothes, pants. You can be happy for a long time just by smelling the smell. We all saw it. Everyone agreed. Daniel couldn't bear it any longer. Before he could finish his words, Michael punched him hard on the bridge of his nose. Blood spurted out immediately. He screamed in pain, but didn't dare to resist. Go on. Michael held up the knife, forcing him to continue. Daniel cried. This matter was instigated by my mother. She set the date as the 5th and asked me to bring people to bully Sister Grace. Hearing this, my face turned even colder. On July 5th of my previous life, I was drinking outside, and Grace was indeed not in the right mood during that time. It turned out that these people had bullied her in her previous life. You little bastard. What nonsense are you talking about? Daniel's mother was pinned to the ground, but she still argued loudly. I did this all for you. Don't you just want Grace to be your wife? Aunt you also spoke up. Johnson, Daniel's mother did have something on her mind about this matter, but Daniel was the most noisy one when he entered Grace's house. If it weren't for Grace's stubborn temper, I don't know what would have happened. I sneered at Daniel. He wanted to continue to argue, but Michael stabbed his palm with a knife, and blood splattered. He wailed in pain. Brother Dao, be gentle. I won't dare to do it again. Michael pulled out the knife, licked the tip of the knife, and spat it out. Why does your blood still smell fishy? Tell me how you like it. And keep making it up. Daniel was so scared that he started to cry. No, no, no. It's not me who likes her. It's my dad who likes her. He pointed directly at Daniel's dad. Daniel's dad was so angry that his beard stood up. You bastard. I think Grace is suitable to be my daughter-in-law. I didn't say I like her. Lu Dabiao added. Everyone knows that your father Daniel just wants to find a daughter-in-law who can serve him and see him off to the end of his life. But Daniel is different. He said yesterday that Sister Grace took the initiative to show her affection to him. Pa! Michael slapped Daniel in the face. Take the initiative to show affection? Like you? Want to date you? Do you think we are stupid? Michael sharpened his knife and approached Daniel. Daniel was so scared that he stepped back repeatedly and spoke incoherently. Brother Dow, that's not happening. It's really not happening. I was just talking nonsense. So you're spreading rumors about my sister-in-law? Michael sneered and put the knife directly on Daniel's neck. He looked back at me, and I nodded. Just as the knife was about to stab, Daniel screamed in fear. Yes, it happened. It's true. If you don't believe me, ask Sister Grace. The yard instantly fell silent. Michael turned around and sneered at everyone. It's a rare thing. Your sister-in-law likes you? Fine. Call your sister-in-law out and confront her face to face. Daniel panicked immediately and waved his hands repeatedly. No need. I'm afraid that if Sister Grace admits it, it will embarrass Brother Johnson, which is not good. Stop talking nonsense, Michael yelled, turning around and shouting into the house. Emma, ask the sister-in-law to come out. We have something strange here that we need to confront her about. The atmosphere in the yard became strange, and everyone looked at Daniel with a smile. He lowered his head, trembling all over, and his eyes were full of despair. Chapter 11. Everyone in the yard waited for a while, and Grace came out of the house. She changed into Emma's clothes, a red dress with big white polka dots that made her long legs look slender and long. She seemed a little embarrassed, tugging at the hem of her skirt nervously, with her arms crossed over her chest. Her shy look, coupled with her delicate features, was endearing. I looked at her quietly and suddenly felt very lucky. Such a woman stood by my side and was my person, which made me feel at ease. Daniel was lying on the ground, looking up at her, his eyes showing a hint of reluctance and obsession. He looked at Grace and muttered something in a low voice. Michael stepped on Daniel and sneered. Sister-in-law? The brothers around him immediately shouted in unison. Hello, sister-in-law. The sound made the whole yard buzz. Grace nodded and replied softly, Hello. She looked at Michael and asked in confusion. Michael, Emma said you were looking for me. What's the matter? Michael grabbed Daniel's hair and threw him to the ground. He grinned and said, Sister-in-law, this guy is slandering you. I must make things clear today and clear your name. Grace frowned after hearing this and asked, What are you trying to discredit me about? Michael said nothing more, but just picked up Daniel and slapped him again. Boy, tell your sister-in-law what you just said again. If you don't, I will kill you today. Daniel was shaking from the beating, but he finally spoke. Sister Grace, have you ever thought about living with me? After he said this, my eyebrows jumped and a trace of anger burned in my heart, but I didn't say anything. No, Grace answered without hesitation, and her words stabbed Daniel's heart like a knife. I looked at him coldly from the side, watching his miserable appearance. Daniel's face froze for a moment, and he continued to ask, Is it because of Johnson, or do you really not like me? His voice was already tearful. I don't like you, and I never have. Grace's tone was calm, but every word pierced Daniel, his heart like a nail. Daniel completely collapsed to the ground, like a deflated ball. I saw despair in his eyes, and he didn't even have the courage to look at me. At this moment, Michael suddenly came over with a sly smile on his face. Sister-in-law, do you like Brother Johnson? After saying that, he chuckled and led his brothers to cheer. I looked at Grace. She lowered her head. Her long eyelashes trembled slightly, and a blush appeared on her face. She whispered, I like it. Grace left the room and hurried back home, her face red as a ripe apple. I stood there, watching her back, and I couldn't help feeling warm in my heart. Michael and a group of brothers started to make a fuss. I glanced at them helplessly and shook my head with a hint of doting smile. Daniel on the ground was completely stunned, his eyes full of pain. His tears flowed silently, mixed with the dust, making him look miserable. Daniel must have been desperate. He looked up at me, then quickly lowered his head, as if he was afraid to face me. I glanced at his parents and saw that Daniel's mom and dad lowered their heads and dared not say a word. Their expressions were full of shame. This unfilial son is such a disgrace. How can he hold his head up in the village in the future? Daniel's mother muttered in a low voice, but her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Lu Dabiao stood aside, sneered, and said sarcastically, I've said it before, how could Grace be interested in Daniel, who is so poor? I felt that this farce was about to end. There was no need to waste time on this garbage. I glanced at Michael and said calmly, Michael, end it. Michael nodded immediately, picked up Daniel, and threw him at his parents' feet. Then he looked at Lu Dabiao and said coldly, I will settle the matter with you sooner or later. Michael left. Lu Dabiao's face darkened, and he kicked Daniel hard. He cursed in a low voice. You rubbish, you dare to expose me. Daniel screamed and fell to the ground. His arm was broken by me, and now he was kicked, rolling on the ground in pain. You like Grace? Take a piss and look at yourself? How could you like a poor guy like you? Lu Dabiao cursed angrily, and the scene became more and more chaotic. Daniel's mother was so angry that she went up to fight with Lu Dabiao. The two families soon became a fight, and the neighbors nearby pointed fingers and talked. A strong wind blew, and the people in the yard were in chaos. The neighbors who were watching the scene all hid back home and secretly looked out of the windows. Michael shivered in the wind and came back to me. He looked up at the sky and asked, Brother, is the typhoon really coming? I looked up at the sky to the north, was silent for a moment, and then said, Yes, our village is right in the eye of the typhoon. Michael's eyes widened, and he said in disbelief, Ah, brother, don't be ridiculous. We still have several acres of land at home, and the county is saying that the wind is blowing towards Wujia village. And here it is just a strong wind at best. Chapter 12. Memories of my last life came flooding back to me. That sudden typhoon almost made me lose Grace and Angela. This time, I must not let such a thing happen again. I took a deep breath and told him, Michael, go find Engineer Tang tomorrow to fix the roof and make it more secure. The typhoon is coming, so your family should also prepare quickly. Michael could tell my tone was serious and nodded seriously. Okay, brother, I'll go tomorrow morning. But he paused and mentioned Mr. Tang's daughter. Mr. Tang's daughter is back. She seems to have become an intellectual. The village pays much attention to her now. I heard she is still asking about you. Dang Su Su. I raised my eyebrows. This name was familiar to me. In my previous life, she made me suffer a lot and even forced me into a desperate situation. Well, Tinking said she wants to arrest you. It's probably because you bullied her too much in the past and you owed her father labor fees. It's okay. I sneered. Let Engineer Tang fix the roof. After the repair, we can have a meal together at my house. You can handle the finishing touches. After arranging all this, I turned back to the room, opened the door, and saw Grace sitting by the bed, holding Angela in her arms and coaxing her softly. I walked over and asked softly, Stella, how are Grace and the baby? Did Angela have any reaction to the vaccine? Stella looked up at me while packing up her medicine box and said, You finally know how to care about them? It's a pity that Grace was too weak and almost couldn't save the child. Her tone was a little accusatory. Don't be so mean to Grace. Look at how much she has been wronged. Can you be nicer to her? It's my fault. I nodded seriously, feeling a little guilty, and turned to look at Grace. She said softly, Stella, don't talk about him. I am also responsible. Her words made me feel distressed, and Angela in my arms fluttered her little hands, insisting that I hold her. I took her, gently touched her ankle wound and needle hole, and comforted her with heartache. Stella was about to leave. I quickly called her. Stella, please stay for dinner. Thanks to your help today, we have to thank you very much. Stella was stunned for a moment and seemed a little surprised by my attitude. However, she immediately showed a helpless smile. Forget it. What food do you have at home to treat me? Emma went to the kitchen and shrugged helplessly. There is nothing, not even the steamed buns. Stella sighed softly, obviously understanding the family's predicament. Stella, I got a black chicken today and am preparing to stew it into a medicinal dish to nourish your body. You can stay and help me. I said calmly with a firm look in my eyes. Black chicken? Stella was stunned, as if shocked by the word. She whispered, Johnson, you're not lying to me, are you? I didn't say much. Holding Angela in my arms, I walked to the kitchen and lifted the upside-down water tank easily. There were a few clucking sounds from the water tank, and I took out 2 big yellow chickens from it. Angela held a shiny black chicken. When the 3 chickens appeared in front of everyone, the whole room fell silent. Emma exclaimed, Brother Johnson, where did you get these 3 chickens? Even capitalists don't have as much luxury as you. Stella looked at the black chicken with shock in her eyes. She stared at it for a long time, finally swallowed her saliva, and whispered, This is a real black chicken. She really wanted to eat chicken. Even if you don't want to eat chicken, you can just drink some chicken soup. Chapter 13. Johnson, you didn't steal these 3 chickens, did you? If the village chief finds out, we'll be in trouble. There was a hint of tentativeness in her tone. Hearing this, Grace and Emma also looked at me, obviously suspicious of the origin of these chickens. I couldn't help but smile. Stella, you think too highly of me, don't you? Steal? Even if you want to steal this chicken, someone has to feed it. I teased softly. Besides, this black chicken is hard to find even in the county town, let alone in the village. Where do you think I can get it from? After I said that, I looked at the three of them and nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, chickens of such good quality have never been seen in the county. Emma muttered and took a closer look, as if trying to verify the truth of my words. At this time, Grace approached me and carefully touched the feathers of the black chicken, with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Johnson, is this really a black chicken? Is it a hen? Can it be raised to lay eggs? I couldn't help but smile when I heard her question. Grace, today these 3 roosters are stewed for you and Angela to nourish your body. She was a little disappointed, but nodded. I went on to comfort her. If you want hens, I'll get a few more for you to raise later. At this moment, a realistic problem was placed before them. Who would cook these 3 chickens? The 3 women looked at each other, all with some embarrassment on their faces. Don't look at me. My sister and mom always cook at home. Killing a chicken is really difficult for me. Emma spoke first. Stella also smiled helplessly. Although I know a little about the pharmacology of medicinal food, but I really don't know how to stew a chicken. Grace said softly, my family killed chickens when I was a child. I've seen it a few times. Just leave it to me. There was a firmness in her tone. I shook my head gently and said with a smile, Grace, don't bother. I'll cook today's meal. Go chat with Stella and Emma. When I said this, the 3 women were stunned, with expressions of disbelief on their faces. Grace opened her mouth, wanting to say something but stopping herself, obviously surprised that I was cooking. Stella was also puzzled and couldn't help muttering, Johnson can cook? My notorious past appearance emerged in her mind, and she was even more suspicious. No matter what they thought, I had already walked out of the door with 3 chickens, set up an iron pot in the yard, and quickly prepared the cooking utensils. At this time, Michael came over from the yard. When he saw me holding the chicken, he was stunned at first, then his eyes widened and he exclaimed, Brother, are you cooking? Well, what's wrong? Without raising my head, I skillfully handled the chicken. While killing and bleeding the chicken, I recalled the days in the kitchen. Having served as a cook in the army for 3 years, I was very familiar with these tasks. Killing chickens, bleeding, scalding, and removing internal organs, all done in one go. Michael stood there blankly, watching my movements with a look of surprise in his eyes. He swallowed and muttered in a low voice, Brother, I didn't know you could do such a serious thing. Daniel's family and Lu Dabiao, who were tied to the pillars, also noticed my actions, and their expressions became extremely complicated. Especially Daniel. When he saw me handling the chicken skillfully, his eyes couldn't help but fall on Grace at the door. Grace stood at the door, her eyes following me with concern and tenderness. Daniel's heart felt like it was hit by a heavy hammer. Broken heart again. Daniel muttered to himself, feeling as weak as a deflated ball. He originally wanted to save the best steamed bread for Grace, but I let Grace eat the chicken directly. This huge gap made him feel sad and ridiculous. The neighbors nearby also leaned their heads out of the windows and cast their eyes on me, who was busy in the yard. The bully Johnson can actually cook? Aunt Yu couldn't help but sigh in a low voice, her eyes full of disbelief. But I ignored their gazes and did not stop my movements. I knew in my heart that I had to make this meal the best, not only for Grace and Angela, but also to protect the people I cherish most. Chapter 14. After I cleaned the chicken's internal organs, I set up the stove, poured clean water into the pot, and put the chopped onions, ginger, and garlic into the cold water. I learned how to make this boiled chicken dish from my comrades in the army. I haven't made it for decades, and I don't know if I can still make it taste the same as it did back then. As the water in the pot gradually boiled, my thoughts were brought back to my military career. Those were days of passion and the time I missed the most. Daniel, who was tied to the pillar. He glanced at Grace standing at the door. After just a glance, he quickly lowered his head. The severe pain in his hand and the kitchen knife in my hand reminded him that if he peeked at Grace again, he might be chopped into the chicken in the pot. Daniel started to have wild thoughts. He remembered the only time I entered the kitchen was when I was drunk and took Grace away from the kitchen a few years ago. He was hiding outside the kitchen wall, listening to the noise inside, and collapsed to the ground. He didn't dare to go over, but the sounds and images kept lingering in his mind. Recalling this, Daniel gritted his teeth and felt a sharp pain in his heart. He looked at the chicken in the pot, then looked at Grace, who was looking at me at the door, and felt that he had lost completely. On the other hand, Lu Dabiao on the pillar didn't take it seriously at all. He was thinking about other women and didn't take my cooking seriously at all. Daniel's father looked at Grace dejectedly, his mind full of regret that such a good daughter-in-law is gone just like that. And he was also worried about whether his son could find a woman like Grace in the future. While they were thinking about their own things, the 3 yellow chicken in the pot was already cooked. I soaked the chicken in cold water and started to prepare the dipping sauce. At this point, the women in the yard were completely attracted by my knife skills and deft technique. They stared at me the whole time without blinking. This knife skill is not like that of an ordinary farmer. Daniel's mother couldn't help but mutter in a low voice, her eyes following my movements, looking at the evenly and delicately cut onion and ginger shreds, her eyes full of shock. After I took the chicken out of the cold water, I used my skillful knife skills to cut the 3 yellow chicken into neat slices. My movements were smooth and silky, without a trace of drag. While plating the dish, I stir-fried the dipping sauce with lard. The rich aroma of onions instantly filled the entire yard, and the fragrance made everyone hold their breath. It smells so good. Aunt Yu leaned against the window and took a deep breath. She couldn't help swallowing and almost leaned out of the window. The men in the yard were also tempted by the aroma. Lu Dabiao and Daniel were almost drooling, staring at the chicken in the pot. When I served this poached chicken, I divided it into 3 large plates. Each plate was filled with tender chicken, and the aroma of the dipping sauce was even more fragrant. When I brought the plates into the room, the 3 women in the room, Grace, Stella, and Emma, were all shocked by the 3 plates of boiled chicken and stared at me in amazement as I put down the plates. Chapter 15. I put 3 plates of boiled chicken on the table and turned back to the spicy chicken. The 3 women in the room looked at each other, their eyes all fixed on the boiled chicken on the table. Grace watched me cooking from the yard and looked over here. When she saw the poached chicken, her eyes flashed with amazement and a little disbelief. What a nice smell. She sighed softly, her words carrying an undisguised greed. The previous fragrance was already tempting, and now that the chicken was right in front of her, the fragrance was even more fragrant. She swallowed lightly, obviously unable to hold it in. Emma and Stella had the same expression, and Emma even had saliva hanging from the corners of her mouth. Sister Grace, did Brother Johnson really do this? Emma asked in disbelief, her tone full of shock. She leaned forward, took a deep breath of the aroma, and couldn't help but sigh. Oh my God, look at the chicken skin, so white and tender. It's cut so beautifully. Stella looked at the 3 plates of white-cut chicken and fell silent. All of the past few years flashed through her mind, and she suddenly felt that Grace was actually luckier than her. I'm going to get some fresh air. Stella seemed a little overwhelmed and stood up and walked out the door. However, the scene at the door made her stunned. I was standing in front of the stove, skillfully turning the wok with my left hand and stir-frying the chicken pieces with my right hand. The red peppers were bubbling in the wok, and the aroma was wafting. The firelight from the stove reflected on me, and the focused look on me made Stella dazed. She suddenly felt a little regretful. If we hadn't broken up, she would be the one sitting in the house waiting for dinner. When I brought 2 plates of spicy chicken into the house, Stella was still in a daze at the door. I looked at her absent-minded look and reminded her with a smile. What are you doing here? Come in quickly. The black chicken soup will be ready soon. Stella blushed slightly, responded in a low voice, and returned to the house. About 5 minutes later, the black chicken soup was served, and the rich aroma immediately filled the whole room. The table was filled with dishes, including boiled chicken, spicy chicken, and black chicken soup, each of which exuded an alluring aroma. Everyone in the room was stunned, staring at the dishes. Don't just look, eat, I reminded with a smile, but everyone looked at me, as if waiting for me to say something. Michael smiled and whispered, Brother, you prepared a table full of the most expensive dishes in the village. You should at least say a few words, otherwise we won't dare to pick up our chopsticks. I picked up the glass and said with a smile, No drinking today, water instead. Stella, this meal is to thank you. I paused, then continued, whether it's Grace, Angela, or the rest of us, we've all been taken care of by you, and I'm really grateful to you. I'll have to trouble you to take care of Grace and Angela in the future. Stella raised her cup. Her eyes were a little complicated, but she still smiled and said, Don't worry, I will take care of Grace and Angela. After clinking glasses, everyone finally started eating. Michael and Emma were the first to pick up a piece of boiled chicken and put it in their mouths. Their eyes widened instantly. Delicious, Michael exclaimed, looking at me seriously. Brother, Your cooking skills are much better than those chefs in the snack street. There is simply no comparison. Brother, if you open a restaurant, those chefs will have to close their shops. Emma nodded repeatedly, her eyes full of amazement. Stella picked up a piece of spicy chicken and put it in her mouth. She was immediately surprised by the spicy taste and couldn't help but exclaimed, "It smells so good. Come and try it." The spicy aroma filled the whole room, and every bite whetted people's appetite, and all worries seemed to be thrown behind them. The atmosphere in the room instantly became relaxed and warm. Chapter 16. During the meal, Grace handed me a bowl of black chicken soup, which contained a chicken leg and shredded chicken. It was clearly prepared with great care. I looked at the soup, and a warm feeling surged through my heart. I looked up at her. She was holding Angela in her arms. She carefully cut the chicken into shreds and fed them into Angela's open mouth, her eyes full of tenderness. "Dad, can Angela have another bite?" Angela turned to look at me, her eyes full of expectation. I smiled and hugged her in my arms while serving Grace a bowl of chicken soup and handing it to her. "Grace, you eat first. I'll take care of Angela." I followed her example and tore the chicken into shreds to feed Angela in my arms. I couldn't help laughing when I saw her mouth full of grease. Grace looked at the black-bone chicken in the bowl. Her eyes flashed with emotion. She scooped up a spoonful of chicken soup and drank it. Her eyes suddenly lit up. "Johnson, this black-bone chicken is so delicious." She smiled with her lips pursed, her face flushed with excitement, lowered her head to lick the soup off her hands, but couldn't help but whispered to me, "Johnson, is this black chicken very expensive?" Hearing her words, I smiled slightly, put down the spoon, and said softly, "Don't even mention a black chicken. Even if you want the moon, I can pick it for you." Grace's face turned red as an apple after hearing this, and she muttered softly, "The child is still here. Why are you saying this?" She lowered her head shyly and continued to drink her soup. Stella sat next to us, put down her spoon, glanced at us, and said sourly, "You two are almost done. There are so many people here. Be careful of the occasion." Michael sipped his soup and joked, "Brother, why does this soup smell like vinegar? Did someone get jealous?" As soon as he finished speaking, Emma smiled and added, "It really is. The vinegar smell is very strong." Stella's face darkened. She rolled her eyes at them, quickly scooped up a spoonful of spicy chicken, covered her mouth, and stopped talking. I looked at her and smiled, without saying anything more. After the meal, Grace came to me in a low voice and asked timidly, "Johnson, can't you help me today? I want to serve her a bowl of black chicken soup. Is that okay?" "Of course," I nodded. "And you can't just send soup, add a portion of spicy chicken to her family, and send it over." Grace happily responded and went to Aunt Yu's house with chicken soup and spicy chicken. Aunt Yu's family was eating dried sweet potatoes, and when they smelled the aroma of chicken soup, they stared at the bowl in her hand. "Aunt Yu, Johnson asked me to deliver this. He said he wants to thank you for helping us today." Grace put the food down with a smile, a hint of gratitude in her words. Aunt Yu's eyes immediately turned red when she heard this. She held Grace's hand and choked up, "Child, Aunt Yu didn't take good care of you these years. I'm sorry for you, and even more sorry for your parents." Grace supported her and said gently, "Aunt Yu, I remember your care for me over the years. Besides, life is lived and hard times can turn into good times." As she finished speaking, Aunt Yu's tears flowed even harder, but her eyes were full of relief and emotion. Chapter 17. After I helped Aunt Yu up, she held my hand tightly and said with emotion, "My child, your family has suffered so much. Your elder brothers and sisters were confiscated and exiled, and you were taken over by Johnson. If I had been in this hard life, I would have died a long time ago." Hearing about my parents and sister, my eyes welled up slightly, but I still said softly, "When Angela and the baby in her belly grow up, Johnson and I will save some money to find them and stop them from wandering." I didn't want to talk about these sad things anymore, so I smiled and changed the subject. "Aunt Yu, don't we all have chicken to eat and chicken soup to drink now? Things will get better slowly." Aunt Yu patted my hand, nodded, and said with a hint of relief, "Grace, Aunt Yu takes back what she said before. You will definitely live a good life with Johnson. I have seen that he is the kind of person who can get along with you." I smiled and was about to say goodbye. I pushed open the door of Aunt Yu's house, but found that the yard was full of neighbors. There were 7 or 8 of them, each holding a bowl in their hands, staring at the chicken soup in the yard. They were old and young, and they were all people who had helped me on weekdays. When they saw me coming out, they immediately surrounded me, some begging in a low voice, and some even crying. Grace, please, can you give my child a bowl of chicken soup? I looked at these neighbors who were skinny and hungry, and I felt indescribable. I told them, wait a minute, I'll go ask Johnson. I went back to the house and looked around, but Johnson was nowhere to be seen. Only Stella and Michael were left. I made up my mind and went back to the yard, saying to everyone, there's not much chicken soup left. Let's share it. After hearing this, the neighbors were overjoyed and carefully took the served chicken soup. No one was willing to drink it in big gulps, but just sipped it in small sips, as if it was the most delicious thing in the world. This soup is so delicious. I drank chicken soup when I was young, but it wasn't as delicious as this one. A neighbor exclaimed, Aunt, you brought chicken soup and spicy chicken and sat down in the yard opposite those who had bullied me, eating with a happy look on their faces. Those people looked at the chicken soup in her hands, drooling, but were too embarrassed to speak. Daniel's mother couldn't help it and begged in a low voice, Sister you, can you give me a bite and try it? Aunt Yu sneered. Now you know to call me Sister you? You don't even say a nice word to me on weekdays. Also, Daniel's mom, let me ask you, where did you hear those rumors about Grace? You even made up the size so clearly. It's amazing. Daniel's mother argued stubbornly. I really didn't lie. Director Yang waived her self-study exam fee. Isn't this obvious? Who dares to tear her clothes without any evidence? Daniel's father sighed and frowned. Shut up. If you weren't so anxious to step forward, I would have taken down Johnson tomorrow, and Grace would have been a member of our family long ago. Daniel and his father sang the same tune, not caring about the situation at all. Lu Dabiao sneered at the side. A bunch of idiots. Do you really think you can defeat Johnson by relying on the village chief? Lu Dabiao smiled sinisterly and continued in a low voice. Do you know what the relationship is between the village chief's two daughters and Johnson? Not to mention Emma. Even Lu Tingting. Tut-tut. That's the real relationship. Chapter 18 Grace, we were wrong. Lu Dabiao sneered and said, when Lu Tingting sees me, she has to call me brother now. I made a good move. I brought Michael and Lu Tingting together. From now on, she will be the wife of my capable subordinate. The village director has two daughters, and they both stand on my side. Can you hide your little calculations from me? Lu Dabiao continued to sneer. Daniel's father's face turned pale, and he murmured, it turns out this is a losing game. He saw the situation clearly, as if all hope was shattered. At this time, Aunt Yu looked at the people around her and shook her head. Grace came over with a spoon and added another spoonful of chicken soup to her. A shallow scar on the back of her hand attracted attention. Aunt Yu took her hand and showed it to the men who had bullied her. Do you remember this scar? When your child had a fever, it was burned by Grace when she was boiling medicine. I never expected that you would follow Daniel's mom to bully Grace. Her tone was filled with disappointment and anger. Those who had bullied Grace lowered their heads. Xiao Zhang choked up and said, Aunt Yu, please stop talking. I really regret it. Grace, please scold me. I know I was wrong. Others also admitted their mistakes and expressed deep regret. Grace, we are sorry. We were wrong. We will never listen to that bad woman Daniel as mother again. Looking at their regretful expressions, I felt no ripples in my heart. Grace slowly spoke. I will not forgive you for this matter. You have touched my bottom line. Her tone was cold and firm. My baby and Angela, they are my life. After she finished speaking, everyone's face turned pale. They realized that they might have lost one of the kindest and most gentle friends. Regret and pain surged in their hearts. After saying that, Grace turned and left and began to clean the pot of chicken soup that had been drunk to the last drop. Aunt Yu and the female neighbors also cleaned the stove together. While cleaning up, someone joked, Grace, why did Johnson take such a big pot of chicken soup this time? Did you use some honey trap? Grace blushed when asked and stammered. I didn't find him actually. He seemed to be out. Hearing this, Aunt Yu suddenly became nervous and pulled Grace aside. Grace, you are stupid. What if Johnson went to ask the brothers for help? If you divide the chicken soup, what will the brothers do? After hearing what Aunt Yu said, Grace's face turned pale, her body tensed, and she said in a trembling voice, Johnson won't hit me, will he? Aunt Yu sighed. You can't escape this time. If you can't do it, just go out and hide. But Grace shook her head, her eyes full of despair. Hiding will be worse. It will be less severe if you just stand still. Before she finished speaking, she burst into tears and her body began to twitch, as if she had gotten used to such a fate. She returned to the house in a state of despair, and the women could only watch helplessly, unable to help. What she feared was not only the beating she would receive tonight, but also the fact that I had never given her a real sense of security. 5 minutes ago, I took Angela and Emma to the grove to catch cicada monkeys. Emma climbed up the tree. Her short hair, big eyes, and long eyelashes were particularly attractive under the flashlight. She playfully shook me and Angela smiled happily. However, that beam of light brought back a tragic incident in my previous life. On a typhoon night, Emma died in a field with her clothes in disarray. The next day, her body was found to be full of unknown liquid. I still remember clearly how she died, as well as the drugs in her system. This time, I will not let history repeat itself. Chapter 19. Let's stop being gangsters and start a business. I pondered and recalled the cause of Emma's death in my previous life. A drug similar to a knockout drug was found in her body, which was caused by the counterfeit drug dealer Liu Dabiao. Liu Dabiao confessed that his target was Liu Tingting, but because there were so many people, he temporarily changed his target to Emma, who was fighting the flood alone. This made me doubt two things. First, where did the chicken soup come from? The village was so poor that they couldn't even afford food, so the possibility of making chicken soup was almost zero. Second, where did the knockout drug come from? This medicine is not native, but a special medicine that I only learned about when I went to the battlefield later. How could a small character like Liu Dabiao get it? While I was thinking, Emma jumped down from the tree, holding a bag of cicada monkeys to play with Angela, and waved her hand in front of my eyes. Brother, what are you daydreaming about? Emma off in my previous life still flashed in my mind. I smiled and said, it's okay. But in my heart, I had made up my mind to protect them. Emma wrinkled her nose and said playfully, Brother, how did your eyes change when you looked at me? Now you look at me like my father does. We are of different generations, right? I smiled and flicked her head. If you haven't passed the rite of passage at the age of 20, you are still a child. Remember, don't just eat the chicken soup given by others. If you want to drink it, find me and I will make it for you. I said this in front of her grave in my last life, but it was too late then. She pouted and muttered, Brother, you still treat me like a child. How boring. At this time, Michael came back from outside, looking a little worried. I asked him what happened, and he said Grace had come to see him, and then he was silent for a while. I said to him, starting tomorrow, we will strengthen the security around our home and assign someone to protect Emma, Tingting, and your sister-in-law. Michael nodded in agreement. Emma jumped out in dissatisfaction after hearing this. Brother, I can understand you protecting my sister-in-law and my sister, but why are you protecting me? How many men in the village can beat me? She was stubborn, but I knew that the enemy this time was not an ordinary person in the village, but an organized criminal gang from Japan. I just looked at her coldly. She gradually felt guilty, avoided my gaze, and whispered, Isn't it enough for me to listen to you? Don't scare me. She picked up Angela and went back, not forgetting to remind Angela to go to the toilet. Watching her leave, I turned around and patted Michael on the shoulder. When you send Emma back, meet with Tingting and tell her that we will no longer be gangsters. Let's go into business. Michael was stunned, then asked excitedly, Really? Brother, can I really do this? I smiled and said, There is a plate of spicy chicken and wine left in the kitchen. Take it to apologize to Liu Yushan. He jumped for joy. Thank you, brother. Tingting will be very happy to see the spicy chicken. He walked towards the village with a gleam of hope. Chapter 20. Michael held the spicy chicken with a smile on his face, and he had obviously begun to imagine how happy Liu Tingting would be when she saw this dish. He felt that if he could let Tingting eat a bite of chicken, she would definitely look at him with new eyes. I smiled, patted his shoulder, and got up to go home. Michael and I walked through the woods and returned home. In the house, Emma was busy packing food for Stella. Grace lowered her head and didn't dare to look at me, and Angela was already sleeping soundly in bed. Emma packed the spicy chicken and handed it to Stella. Stella was holding the food box and the medicine box and said to me a little embarrassedly, Johnson, I'm so sorry. I didn't bring anything when I came here. I smiled and waved my hand. Dr. Stella came with technology. How can it be said that she didn't bring anything? From now on, Grace and Angela, I will trouble you to take care of them. Stella nodded, which was considered as her agreement. At this time, Michael came out from the kitchen, holding a plate of spicy chicken I left for him. When he saw the one in Stella's hand, he suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. Brother, if all this is packed up and taken away, won't your family have anything to eat? He said a little embarrassedly. I waved my hand and smiled. This was originally prepared for you. Your sister-in-law and Angela are both averse to certain foods, so it's enough to keep black chicken and boiled chicken at home. Michael, send Stella and Emma back safely later, and come back to find me. Michael nodded and looked at Stella. They both stopped talking and walked out the door with their lunchboxes. Grace and I walked them to the door, gave them a few words of advice, and watched them leave. After closing the door, the room instantly became quiet. I looked at Grace. She seemed even more reserved, lowered her head, and even began to avoid me. Her abnormality made me feel that something was wrong. When I finished washing and returned to the house, she had already prepared the foot washing water, knelt in front of me, lowered her head, and carefully washed my feet. Her hands moved very lightly, but she didn't say a word the whole time. Grace, what's wrong? I haven't heard you talk all night. I asked. Hearing what I said, she lowered her head even lower, and tears suddenly fell into the water. Johnson, I know I was wrong. Please don't hit me. I was stunned for a moment, raised my hand to hold her chin, and asked softly, what's wrong? Tell me clearly. Don't cry. She sobbed and explained, I share the chicken soup with my neighbors. I didn't know you left it for your brothers. I won't dare to do it again. I really won't dare. Please don't hit me. After hearing this, I finally understood. Seeing her face full of tears, I sighed and gently patted her face. Grace, is that all? I said I won't hit you again. Don't be afraid. You are the mistress of this family. Do whatever you want, don't ask me everything. After listening to me, she was stunned for a moment, then looked up at me in disbelief. After a while, her tears dried. She showed a long-lost smile and continued to wipe my feet carefully. My feet are so swollen today. Why didn't you let me see them earlier? She muttered, her face full of worry. It's okay. I was too busy during the day and sprained my ankle. I replied casually, thinking that there were still many things to deal with. The safety of my brothers, the arrangements for my family, and the operation of the system farm were all on my mind. As I was thinking, she had already packed up, turned off the light, knelt down in front of me again, and whispered, Johnson, I'll help you sleep. I was stunned by her action, and I quickly helped her up. Grace, you are too tired today. Don't toss and turn, and rest early. She looked at me in surprise, then lowered her head and pursed her lips and asked softly, Johnson, do you think I'm dirty? During the day, I really kept my innocence. I threatened them with my life. I am innocent. I was stunned. Looking at the shallow cut on her neck, my heart ached. I held her hand and said, Grace, no matter what happens, you will always be the most important person to me. Don't say such things again. Her eyes were red, and finally a reassured smile appeared through her tears. Chapter 21, Sister Grace is really treating you well with her life. Johnson took a deep breath. The moonlight shone on Grace's body. It could be said that even in his previous life, among all the women he had seen, none had a figure comparable to Grace's. The places that should be big are big, and the places that should be small are small. A nearly perfect figure. But it was this close viewing that allowed Johnson to see the bloody wounds on Grace's body. All left by Johnson a few days ago. There is still a blood scab on my buttocks. Johnson is no longer the same as before. After 50 years of life and death experience on the battlefield, his mental strength is extremely strong, and he has the blessing of the green lotus eye. It takes at least 2 or 3 hours to stop. Such long and high-intensity exercise is undoubtedly a torture for Grace. What's more, Grace is now pregnant. Johnson took a deep breath and calmed himself down, while Grace stood opposite Johnson. Grace, Stella reminded me that I should try to avoid sex when I'm pregnant because it's not good for the baby. Grace suddenly understood and nodded obediently. Then she put her clothes in order and went to bed next to Angela. Grace was actually not very willing to do that because every time she did it, Johnson would beat her while doing it. But if she didn't take the initiative, Johnson would beat her severely. Many times, Angela woke up. Then Johnson was not afraid of the child seeing and beat her in front of the child. Grace and Angela were both scratched by a wild dog and bullied by a neighbor. They were both very tired and fell asleep soon. After Johnson calmed down, he was ready to go out and wait for Michael. On the way out, Johnson accidentally touched the foot basin on the ground. With a bang, the foot basin collided slightly with the wall, but the sound was not very loud. But it was just this tiny sound that made Grace and Angela hug each other on the bed, curling up in pain. He was still mumbling, "Don't hit me. Don't hit me." Johnson took a deep breath. Years of beatings. The shadow of domestic violence that has accumulated over time. a fierce and brutal image. It's not something that can be easily changed in one night. He will do his best to make it up to them in the rest of his life. Thinking this, Johnson walked out of the room and waited for Michael outside. About 10 minutes later, Michael and a girl with a ponytail came to the courtyard hand in hand. Both of them had greasy lips. Johnson was at the entrance of the courtyard, staring at Grace and Angela's door. Johnson saw the two people approaching from a distance. One is Michael, and the other is Michael's girlfriend Lu Tingting. Lu Tingting smiled shyly, with her light bangs combed down the sides of her ears, gently fluttering in the wind. As she walked towards the courtyard, she gently adjusted her hair with her hands. Seeing the young couple again reminded Johnson of his past life. Before Johnson joined the army, he was in society. Michael followed him all the time until a gunfight, when Michael blocked a bullet for Johnson and fell in front of Johnson. Michael's death, Lu Tingting continued to assist Johnson in place of Michael. After Johnson joined the army, Lu Tingting recognized Michael's parents as her parents and took care of the two elderly people for her whole life. After the elderly people passed away, Lu Tingting also passed away. Lu Tingting went to see Johnson once before leaving. But Johnson didn't expect that would be the last time he saw Lu Tingting. Thinking of this, Johnson's eyes became red. Both of them have been through thick and thin with him. But Johnson didn't take good care of them in his previous life. While Johnson was lost in his memories, Michael and Lu Tingting had already arrived at the gate of the courtyard. They held hands shyly and looked at Johnson shyly. Johnson came back to his senses, looked at the two people standing in front of him alive, and smiled from the bottom of his heart. Then he touched Michael's head and said, "Silly boy, why are you so stupid?" Michael smiled foolishly after Johnson touched his head. Lu Tingting also smiled foolishly. After the two of them laughed foolishly for a while, Lu Tingting licked her greasy lips and said with a smile, "Brother, the spicy chicken is absolutely amazing. It's so delicious. My dad was so drunk that he drank 2 more tails of wine." After Lu Tingting finished speaking, she looked at Michael and smiled sweetly, and both of their lips were greasy. "Haha, as long as it suits your taste." Johnson smiled. The young couple reconciled. Lu Tingting looked inside the courtyard and saw that the lights in Johnson's house were off. Lu Tingting became worried. Lu Tingting said worriedly, "Brother, I heard from Michael about Sister Grace and Angela's situation. Are they okay? Can I go see them?" The conditions of Grace and Angela still need to be observed. At present, they are fine. They are asleep, so don't disturb them. I won't go in tonight, and will sleep at the door. Grace and Angela will not sleep well if I stay in the room. After all, I used to beat them all the time. There was a hint of bitterness at the corner of Johnson's mouth. Mingming was reborn, and it was a very happy thing to see Grace and Angela again. But he discovered that the person in this world who made the mother and daughter feel most insecure and even fearful was himself. Seeing Johnson's bitter look, Lu Tingting opened her mouth slightly. "Brother, I don't know why, but when I saw you for the first time today, I felt like I had changed. Although I don't know what happened, I believe that I will treat Sister Grace and Angela well in the future." Lu Tingting spoke very seriously. Michael also nodded seriously. Johnson took a deep breath. After thinking for a moment, he said to Michael and Lu Tingting, "I called Michael back because of Grace and Angela's matter. The harm I caused to Grace and Angela was too deep, but they both stayed with me. No matter how I beat her, Grace took care of me every day. No matter how I beat Angela, she didn't want to leave me." Johnson's eyes turned red as he spoke. "I want to do something for them." Lu Tingting's eyes were red. She said to Johnson, "Brother, Grace is really treating you well with her life. You must cherish her and stop hitting her. When you lose her, it will be too late." Johnson nodded and took a deep breath. "There is a tradition in our county that all young people have to have a coming-of-age ceremony when they turn 20. I want to hold a coming-of-age ceremony for Grace." Johnson paused and said seriously, "Grace will be 20 next month. According to the rules, she should return to the village to hold her coming-of-age ceremony, but her parents were exiled to Province G and cannot do so. I think this matter cannot be let go. I want to hold a coming-of-age ceremony for Grace in our village. I want to do my best to make it up to her." Lu Tingting's eyes gradually turned red. "Brother, Sister Grace really likes this coming-of-age ceremony. Every time we go to attend the coming-of-age ceremony of the villagers, Sister Grace will secretly shed tears because Sister Grace knows that she can't have a coming-of-age ceremony in her situation. She really likes it. Chapter 22 is a good place to make a lot of money. After listening to Lu Tingting's words, Johnson was silent. He took a deep breath. In her previous life, Grace not only did not have a coming-of-age ceremony on her birthday, she was also brutally beaten to death by a gang of neon Japanese gangsters. That day was the darkest day in her life. Was also the darkest day in Johnson's life. In this life, Johnson was reborn. He would never let this happen again. Johnson wanted to turn the darkest day in Grace's life into the happiest day of her life. He wanted to give Grace the happiest and most beautiful coming-of-age ceremony. After thinking for a moment, Johnson looked at Michael and Lu Tingting. Michael, on August 2nd, I will invite the entire village to witness Grace's coming-of-age ceremony and to bless her. You and your brothers can help with the preparations. You don't have to worry about the money, just go for it boldly. I'll find a way. Johnson's words were filled with great affection. Michael nodded after hearing this and said, Brother, I understand. My brothers and I will do our best to hold Sister Grace's coming-of-age ceremony. Lu Tingting followed up and said, Leave everything related to the village to me. Brother Johnson, if Sister Grace knew about what you did for her, she would definitely be very happy. Lu Tingting's eyes were red. She was moved by Johnson's affectionate look. After hearing what Lu Tingting said, Johnson showed a hint of bitterness. For some things, you really only regret it after you lose them. After a moment, Johnson said, Michael, Tingting, I hope this can be done in secret. I want to give Grace a surprise. She has suffered so much following me these years, and this matter has just started, so don't let her worry about it anymore. After Johnson finished speaking, Michael and Lu Tingting nodded. Then the three of them discussed the general framework of the coming-of-age ceremony. When discussing the cost, Lu Tingting remembered what Michael said to her father, saying that he would no longer be a gangster and would go into business. While Lu Tingting was silent, Johnson and Michael were still discussing the coming-of-age ceremony. Lu Tingting didn't quite believe what Michael said. They all grew up in the same village. Johnson and Michael, apart from being good at fighting and ruthless, do not have any qualities that fit the businessmen. Lu Tingting gritted her teeth and asked, Brother, my dad agreed to let us continue dating after hearing Michael say he wanted to quit being a gangster and go into business. Are you serious? Do you really want to go into business? Have you decided where you're going to go? Lu Tingting finished speaking. She looked at Johnson. Michael quickly said, Tingting, don't be so anxious. Brother Johnson just decided to go into the sea today. How can he decide where to go so quickly? Lu Tingting frowned slightly after hearing this. Michael, are you trying to fool my dad by pretending to be Brother Johnson? My dad didn't agree with us in the first place. If you lied to him again this time, we'll really be done for. Michael was speechless after hearing Lu Tingting's question and could only look at Johnson next to him. Johnson thought for a moment. Then he said calmly, The place to go to the sea business has been decided. We will go to Dongji City in Ji Province. But we have to wait until Grace has given birth to the baby and her body recovers. Before going to the sea business, I will do business in the snack street with my brothers and make enough capital first. He now has his own space. This means there is the possibility of unlimited resources. In the previous life, many of the wars he participated in were triggered by the scramble for resources. In this life, he doesn't have to compete with other countries for resources. He himself can become a resource provider with unlimited possibilities. After he finished speaking, Johnson smiled and joked, You two had better get married during this period. Once you start working in the entertainment industry and get busy, you won't have time. Didn't you ask Emma to come and ask when to give the betrothal gifts last time? Why don't we discuss it today and set a time for me to bring Michael to your house to give the betrothal gifts? Oh my, Brother Johnson, how could you say this out loud? I never asked Emma about this. It's so embarrassing. Lu Tingting blushed, turned her head away, and said nothing. Michael rubbed his head stupidly, then followed up Johnson's question and asked, Brother, is there any special place in East G City? It seems like a lot of people go there. East G City. It's a great place to make a lot of money. Johnson smiled. In the previous life, with the gradual opening up, there was a large wave of entrepreneurship, and the prospects for East G City were very good. Many people made a lot of money. Michael and Lu Tingting heard that they could make a lot of money. They couldn't suppress the smiles in their eyes. And the reason why Johnson went to East G City was not just this. Johnson looked up the cause of death of Grace as parents and sister in his previous life. Grace's parents were exiled to Guangdong Province. They worked as laborers in a factory in Dongji City. My younger sister followed him to East G City, but disappeared on the way to find her parents. Later, she was abducted by human traffickers and taken to a dance hall in East G City to work as a prostitute. Later, she was spotted by the leader of an underground organization and became a slave. Eventually, my sister couldn't bear the humiliation and committed suicide. After learning that their sister had committed suicide and Grace had been violently beaten to death, Grace's parents both jumped into the river and died. Johnson closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Before Grace's parents and sister were exiled to the province, they were the same as Grace. Johnson beat him every day, especially my younger sister. She would be bullied by Johnson. The whole family suffered from Johnson's torture. After learning of their deaths in his previous life, Johnson felt extremely guilty. But by then, everything was too late. But this life is different. He was born again. He won't let this happen again. Johnson won't beat them or bully them when he sees them. Grace's parents and sister have always been a thorn in her side. It is also a knot in Johnson's heart that he cannot untie. After things here are settled, he will take Grace to East G City to settle things in East G City. Michael and Lu Tingting were still immersed in the fantasy of making a fortune. Johnson sorted out his thoughts. It would take some time before he left East G City, so he needed to focus on solving the current problems. Michael, how's the investigation going into the underwear in Grace's locker? Michael could speak. Lu Tingting spoke first. Brother, I have a friend who works in the same workshop with Sister Grace. The underwear was deliberately put in Sister Grace's locker by their factory manager and workshop director, and then deliberately let people see it. The director of the silk reeling factory is Yang Shunshui. The workshop director seems to be Susan, Johnson said with a frown. Yes, they are the two. They are both perverts. Several female workers have been bullied by them. It is so humid in the silk reeling factory and hot in the summer. You have to change into thin work clothes when you go there. Sister Grace has such a good figure and is so beautiful. They will definitely not let Sister Grace go. They spread rumors and slandered Sister Grace just to take the opportunity to bully her. It makes me so angry. When it comes to the two perverts in the silk reeling factory, Lu Tingting is filled with anger. Grace is such a kind person. Are they going to bully her? Johnson's eyes gradually turned cold. Michael, call your brothers tomorrow and go to the silk reeling factory with me to look for Yang Shunshui and Su Shanshan. Chapter 23, Has He Really Reformed? The next morning, while Grace and Angela were still sleeping soundly in the house, Johnson had already entered the kitchen and started preparing breakfast for them. He also prepared lunch for them to take to the factory. Grace has always prepared breakfast and lunch for him. No matter how much pain she felt or how wrong she felt, Grace always persisted. In the past, he not only did not cherish them, but sometimes even beat them in the morning. As for making breakfast for Grace and Angela, that's even more impossible. Think of this. Johnson took a deep breath, rolled up his sleeves, take out the boiled chicken and black chicken soup. Getting angry, I made a fried chicken dish for the mother and daughter, then stew the black chicken soup again. The aroma of chicken filled the whole house. After the soup was heated, Grace and Angela woke up. Grace stretched lazily, revealing the curve of her chest, and Angela rubbed her eyes cutely. Grace and Angela woke up. The first thing they did was to hide in the corner and timidly observe Johnson. Johnson was coming out of the kitchen, calling Grace and Angela to eat. Grace and Angela watched Johnson for a while. They found that Johnson had no intention of hitting them. Grace hugged Angela and whispered, Angela, Daddy is in a good mood today and didn't hit us. Let's not make Daddy angry, okay? Angela nodded lovingly. Yes, Angela will be very good. Grace smiled and touched Angela's cute little head. Even if Johnson didn't hit her, he would usually grab her hair and slap her, or tear off her clothes and pants and do that again. But there was nothing today. Grace looked at Johnson busy in the kitchen with some curiosity. Has he really reformed? Grace and Angela got dressed. Johnson had already served the boiled chicken and black chicken soup. Chopsticks, spoons, and soup bowls were also placed on the table. White-cut chicken is fried in chicken fat, golden color and fragrant aroma. The black chicken soup has been recooked. The soup is rich and mellow and has high nutritional value. Grace and Angela sat at the table and were stunned by the golden white-cut chicken and the extremely fragrant black chicken soup. Johnson served each of them a bowl of black chicken soup. Johnson smiled, then sat next to Angela, scooped a small spoonful of black chicken soup, blew on it, and put it into Angela's mouth. Ouch! Angela was extremely happy after drinking the black chicken soup. Her big, round eyes stared at the soup in front of her, as if she was still not satisfied. Grace picked up a piece of fried chicken with chopsticks. I almost screamed out, "Wow, Johnson, this is delicious. Even better than yesterday's. Is it fried in oil?" Grace was a little surprised because they didn't have any oil at home. Not only their family, but no one in the entire yard could use oil. Johnson laughed. "It's fried in chicken fat. I saved some chicken fat from yesterday." Grace nodded. "So that's how it is? It's so delicious. Johnson, you can really be a chef." Johnson smiled. In 1982, being a chef was something to be proud of. But what Johnson wants to do is not a frontline job like chef. What he wants to do is to be on the supply side. That is, a resource tycoon who controls unlimited resources. The three of them finished their breakfast quickly. After breakfast, Johnson and Grace cleaned up the dishes. While Johnson was washing in the kitchen, Grace walked in with the dishes. She also saw the lunchbox in the kitchen, which was full of chicken. Grace knew that she would have to get up very early to prepare all these, not to mention preparing lunch for her and Angela. "Johnson, I'm sorry. I got up late today. These are what I should have done. I will definitely get up early tomorrow. I don't know what happened to me yesterday. I slept so well. I overslept." Johnson took a deep breath. Then he smiled and said, "There is no such thing as what a couple should or shouldn't do. Whoever has time can do it." Grace smiled sweetly. Johnson finished washing up. He glanced at the lunch prepared for Grace and Angela in the kitchen. Grace was also looking at the lunchbox, seeming a little embarrassed. Johnson thought for a moment. Johnson took a deep breath and said, "Grace, if you are not satisfied with the work in the silk reeling factory, don't go. I will support you. The work is too tiring." The silk reeling factory director Yang Shunshui and the workshop director Su Shanshan mentioned by Lu Tingting yesterday are both hooligans. In addition, the work in the silk reeling factory is very tiring, and he doesn't want Grace to suffer that. Grace smiled and shook her head. "Johnson, are you tired? Isn't that what work is like? There are always times when things don't go as planned. And this is a job that my parents introduced me to. I want to keep doing this and see if I can get some news from my parents." Johnson thought for a moment. This job was indeed introduced by Grace's parents, but after something happened to Grace's parents, they were exiled to Province G. Without her parents' connections, Grace's position in the factory became very low. Johnson also knew that Grace's parents who were wandering outside had always been a source of worry for her. "Grace, when everything here is over, I will go with you to find your parents and sister. We can't let them wander outside for too long." Hearing Johnson's words, Grace had tears in her eyes. "Yeah, okay." After saying this, Grace wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and said with a smile, "During this period of time, I will work hard to pass the adult college entrance examination. When I go out, I will be an intellectual, and it will be easier for me to find a job in other places." Since Johnson hired Tang Gong to repair the roof, Grace took Angela to the silk reeling factory today. Grace took an umbrella and carried Angela to the silk reeling factory. Johnson had insisted that she take the umbrella. Johnson said Lujia village is in the eye of the typhoon, and there will be heavy rain in the next 2 days. Grace was a little confused. Johnson had a low level of education and could barely read or write. How could he know about astronomy and geography? Will a typhoon really come? What made Grace a little confused was, today, leaders from the county came to inspect the silk reeling factory. There are few visitors from the county. Combined with what Johnson said about the typhoon, there was also the buzz in the county about wanting to make an example of Johnson. This cast a shadow over Grace's heart. She was afraid that Johnson would be listed as an example and thrown into prison. She had to do something for Johnson. Grace arrived at the silk reeling factory. She went straight into the dressing room. Grace opened her locker and changed her clothes, pants, and shoes. The magnificent curves are revealed. The slender waist is just enough to be grasped, and the long, straight legs are white and flawless. Grace was thinking about Johnson and was a little distracted, so she didn't notice a pair of eyes in the crack of the locker room door, staring at Grace's back. Chapter 24. My man can feed me. I don't need other men's help. Grace put her changed clothes and pants into the closet and changed into work clothes from the silk reeling factory. The work clothes given to her by the workshop director Yang Shunshui were a little small and very tight when she wore them, especially since she was well-developed and had a big bust. The buttons on her chest had broken off several times, and she had to sew the clothes with needle and thread to prevent them from breaking. After changing her clothes, Grace carried Angela out of the locker room. She was distracted along the way because of the incident in which Johnson was listed as a typical case. She even left the locker without locking it. Grace left. A while later, a wretched figure sneaked into the locker room. After this person came in, he locked the locker room door. This person is Susan, the workshop director of the silk reeling factory. Susan entered the locker room. She began to look around the lockers of the female employees, checking one by one to see whose lockers were unlocked. Soon Susan found that Grace's locker was unlocked. Grace is the most beautiful woman in Lujia village. He had been interested in Grace for a long time, but he had the desire but not the courage. Grace by giving her clothes in a smaller size or secretly putting a piece of underwear in Grace's closet. Susan opened the locker and was greeted by a burst of charming fragrance. Then he stayed there for a while. Susan and Grace had dated before, but he didn't take advantage of the situation. Why didn't you cherish her back then? Otherwise, I would be bullying her every day now. Although they broke up, Susan took extra care of Grace. Among the female workers in Susan's workshop, only Grace was allowed to bring her children to work. Other female workers were not allowed. Susan even used her connections to waive Grace as self-study exam fees. I've been so good to Grace and even gifted her high-end underwear. She should be tempted, right? It's better to follow me than to follow that bully Johnson, who can't make back the money and beats Grace all the time. Susan murmured with great distress. He had peeked at Grace many times, and every time he could see the bloody wounds on Grace's body. At the same time, he also knew that all the money Grace earned was used to buy alcohol for Johnson. Every day at noon, my lunchbox is filled with dried sweet potatoes. Susan took out a steamed bun from her trouser pocket and prepared to give one to Grace. Grace probably hasn't eaten steamed cornbread for more than a year. I wonder how happy Grace would be after seeing this steamed bun. Will you pledge yourself to me? Susan took a final deep sniff of her clothes, put them back in the closet, and walked out of the women's locker room with a steamed bun. Grace had already started working at this time, and Angela was playing not far away with a chicken leg in her hand. Susan walked up to Grace, still holding a steamed bread in her hand, and glanced at Grace's magnificent chest. Then, as soon as Grace raised her head, he immediately looked away. He didn't have the courage to harass female workers in the workshop. Seeing Grace raise her head, Susan asked, "Grace, are you tired from work recently? If you are tired, come to my room and rest for a while." Grace shook her head and said, "It's okay, I'm not tired." Seeing that Grace didn't pay much attention to him, Susan reached out and patted Grace on the shoulder. "Grace, has Johnson hit you recently? If he hits you again, tell me and I'll punish him. Others are afraid of him, but I'm not." Grace said without looking up, "Johnson doesn't hit me anymore. He's changed." After saying that, Grace smiled coldly. "Don't be so boastful. There are a few people in the village who are not afraid of my man, and you are not one of them. Last time my man came to the factory, you were the one who ran the fastest." Grace's words made Susan feel choked up. Susan's face turned pale, and it took her a long time to recover. Then she smiled again and put the steamed bread in front of Grace. "Grace, don't be so hostile to me. I'm still nice to you. Look, what is this? You haven't eaten steamed bread for more than a year, right? Even if you don't eat it, the child can't always eat dried sweet potatoes, right?" After Susan finished speaking, she called Angela, who was playing not far away. "Angela, come quickly, Uncle will give you some steamed bread." Angela came skipping over from a distance, holding a chicken drumstick in her hand. When Susan saw the chicken drumstick in Angela's hand, she was stunned. Susan was stunned. "How come you're eating chicken legs? What's going on?" Even when their factory director went out to treat everyone to a meal, they rarely had chicken legs. Everyone just drank some soup and had a piece of chicken at best. Like this situation where each person takes a big chicken leg. It's totally unheard of. Angela gnawed on the chicken leg and said, "Dad cooked black chicken for Angela. This is a black chicken leg. It's delicious." "Black chicken? What kind of chicken is black chicken?" This is beyond Susan's knowledge. Susan smiled awkwardly. Grace was not interested in the steamed buns he gave her. Angela was full of glutinous rice and didn't even look at the buns. Grace said without even looking up, "Director Young, please take the steamed bread back. My man can feed me. I don't need help from other men." Susan's face turned green when she heard this. The female workers who came and when all looked over here, and some of them heard their conversation and were chattering about it. "Look, the shameless Director Yang is harassing the female workers again." "Shameless." Susan saw the female workers chattering and shouted angrily. "What are you doing? Rebellion? Don't have to work? Be careful, or I'll deduct your wages." Hearing Susan's words, the female workers dispersed. Grace stopped her work and looked up at Susan. "Director Young, please don't show off in front of me. I want to ask you, what's the matter with the underwear in my closet? What are you going to do? Also, why is my work clothes one size smaller? I've asked about it. There are obviously large sizes. Why did you give me a small size? Susan smiled awkwardly. Well, I will definitely check the underwear issue. As for the work clothes, I will adjust a new batch of work clothes for you later. Don't be so hostile. Susan paused after she finished speaking and continued. Grace, I've been very kind to you in the factory, haven't I? Can you see which female worker has children working with them like you? Your family is in financial difficulty. But wasn't it me who helped you get the tuition for your self-study exam? There are so many female workers taking the self-study exam. Can you see who I exempted the tuition for? Grace thought for a moment. Director Young, you helped me waive the self-study exam fee, and I'm not ungrateful. I'm very grateful to you for all this, but can you please stop chatting with me all the time? The factory always says that I'm not concentrating on my work and keeps deducting my salary. The money deducted can pay for the self-study exam fee several times. Susan nodded and smiled, then turned her eyes and looked in the direction of her office, and then glanced at Grace's tense chest. Grace, as you know, people from the county came today, including the leaders in charge of the self-study exam. I saw that they brought a stack of test questions, but I don't know if they are for the self-study exam. Do you want to go and take a look? Grace heard that it was a self-study exam question. Her eyes lit up. Self-study exam questions? Are they review questions? If they are real exam questions, then I won't look at them. I have to make a living based on my real abilities. I have worked hard for so long. I have to give myself a real result. Susan smiled brightly. I don't know about that. They are having a meeting in the factory director's office. The questions are in my office. Go and take a look. If they say exam questions, you won't read them. If they're review questions, then they must be a benefit given by the county leaders to the candidates in our factory. It's okay. Grace thought about it carefully. Then he bit his lip. Okay, I'll go with you and take a look, but as promised, if it's a test question, I definitely won't look at it. After saying that, Grace followed Susan into the workshop director's office. After they entered the office, Grace went to the desk to look at the test questions, while Susan leaned against the office door and quietly locked it. Chapter 25 Typhoon is coming, roof repair. On the other side, Grace and Angela just left. Michael brought engineer Tang and the construction team to the courtyard and quickly started the repair work. Johnson stood in the yard and gave guidance on the roof repair work from time to time. In the previous life, Grace had always wanted to have the roof repaired. Johnson slapped Grace several times when she mentioned the roof repair to him, and Grace never dared to mention it again. Johnson vaguely remembered Grace's envious look when he saw other people's houses were not leaking whenever it rained. I vaguely remember Grace holding the tools and patching up the roof herself. Grace really wants to live their life well. It's just that he was such a jerk at that time. I don't know why Grace came back and saw that the roof of the house was being repaired. How happy would you be? Johnson stood in the yard and took control of the situation. Michael followed the construction team up to the roof and supervised the work. Engineer Tang and the construction team members were trembling as they repaired the roof, not even daring to look at Johnson. Engineer Tang was shivering on the roof. He came here today to ask for his wages. Johnson owed them a year's worth of construction fees. At the beginning of the construction, they used IOUs, but in the end, they didn't even use IOUs. He could only record the accounts one by one in a small account book. Every time he took the account book to ask for his salary, he would be beaten by Johnson. Johnson is the leader of the village hooligans, and they are not the ones who can afford to offend him. I had thought that after finally paying for Tang Shushu's schooling, life would finally be a little easier. But he had a son in his old age, and there was nothing he could do. The family really couldn't make ends meet. His wife scolded him for being incompetent every day, and she even refused to pay him for his wages and was about to kick him out of the house. Mr. Tang glanced at Johnson furtively. Just this one glance almost scared him to death. Johnson seemed to become even scarier than before, and his eyes seemed to be glowing green. How can I ask for this money? As he thought about it, Tang Gong started to cry on the roof. Michael saw this and came down from the roof to Johnson's side. Brother, Engineer Tang is crying on the roof. I'm afraid it's because of the construction fee. Michael finished speaking. Johnson glanced at Engineer Tang on the roof, and their eyes met. Engineer Tang noticed that Johnson was looking at him, and he was so scared that he trembled all over and never dared to look back. Mr. Tang, Tang Shushu's father. Johnson thought for a moment. In his previous life, Tang Shushu, who was admitted to the judicial department, caused him a lot of trouble. The hatred between him and Tang Shushu started when he chopped off Tang Gong's hands. At that time, in order to support his young son, Engineer Tang risked his life to come to him to ask for construction fees. Johnson directly asked Michael to chop off Engineer Tang's hands. This led to Tang Shushu being admitted to the judicial department, always wanting to avenge her father. But instead of getting his revenge, he was stabbed to death by Johnson and thrown into the mountains to feed the wolves. Before Tang Shushu died, they even took turns bullying Tang Shushu and found an account book in his clothes. That account book is the one that Mr. Tang has in his hand now. It is densely packed with records, and even the principal and interest are recorded clearly. The total amount including principal and interest is 38 yuan and 24 cents. Later, Johnson took the account book to find Mr. Tang, but Mr. Tang had already died. Johnson chopped off his hands. His wife kicked him out of the house and died of illness outside. This is also the reason why Tang Shushu tried so hard to put him in jail. Johnson took a deep breath. In this life, he will not follow the old path. Tang Shushu is such a ruthless character. He wants to make her his own. Mr. Tang is an honest man. We can't always let honest people suffer losses. Johnson asked Michael to prepare the money, and then called Tang Gong down from the roof. After Tang Gong came down, he gritted his teeth and tremblingly took out the account book from his pocket. His eyes were still red and swollen. Mr. Tang was holding the account book tightly. His hands were shaking a little, his body was dirty, and the hat on his head had several holes in it. He lowered his head and didn't dare to look at Johnson. Like Johnson. Wages? I'm afraid I won't be able to come back in this lifetime. Mr. Tang lowered his head, tears welling up in his eyes. But he seemed to see an envelope handed to him. My eyes are blurry, and I can't see clearly. He wiped his eyes and confirmed again. What was handed to him was an envelope, and he could vaguely see a corner of money inside. Johnson handed the envelope to Engineer Tang and smiled. Engineer Tang, don't you want the wages? When Mr. Tang heard what Johnson said, he raised his head slightly and looked at Johnson, who was holding the envelope. That's when he saw Johnson. Mr. Tang's tears suddenly flowed down. I don't know what happened. He felt that the Johnson in front of him was different from before. Johnson is now like a big sun, even on the eve of this rainy typhoon. He also radiates light and heat like a sun. Johnson still held out his hand, and Engineer Tang took the envelope tremblingly. Mr. Tang wiped his tears and opened the envelope. Mr. Tang was stunned again. $38.24. The money was exactly the same as recorded in his account book, and that includes interest. He remembered that he had never shown this account book to anyone except his daughter Tang Shushu. Moreover, even his daughter Tang Shushu didn't know how much the actual debt was. Boss, this amount of money. Mr. Tang held the envelope and looked at Johnson in confusion. Johnson smiled and said, Why? Is the amount of money wrong? Is it less? After hearing what Johnson said, Engineer Tang quickly shook his head. Not less, not less, not a cent less, even the interest is included. Boss, do you remember the wages of U.S. workers? Johnson smiled and nodded, did not deny it, and gently patted Tang Gong's shoulder. Mr. Tang held the account book in his left hand and the envelope in his right hand, and looked up at the tall Johnson. Boss, if my wife hadn't kicked me out of the house, if the family hadn't been so poor that we couldn't afford to eat, I wouldn't have asked you for the money. I didn't know you remembered it, and you'd even calculated the interest long ago. As Tang Gong was talking, tears started to flow again. Boss, we were wrong about you. I'm just afraid of being poor. I'm really afraid. After listening to what Mr. Tang said, Johnson took a deep breath. Mr. Tang, follow me and work hard. You will get a lot of money, and you can find a wife for your son, right? When Mr. Tang heard Johnson mention his son, his face was filled with smiles. There's no need to worry about the betrothal gift. Let Shushu earn it. When the time comes, let Shushu find a rich family. Then my son will have enough money to marry a wife. After Tang Gong finished speaking, he went to repair the roof with a silly smile. When he got to the roof, Tang Gong shouted to the construction team, We must repair this roof for the boss today, according to the boss's requirements. Even if 2 typhoons come at the same time, we must make it remain intact. If anyone fools around, don't blame me, old Tang, for being rude. The roof repair work was in full swing, and Johnson walked out of the courtyard to get some fresh air. At the intersection not far from the courtyard, there was a well-mannered girl staring at Johnson. Chapter 26. Tang Shushu learned the gangster's exciting boxing? Johnson walked out of the courtyard and fell into deep thought at the gate. This time when I was reborn, the situation was extremely serious. It's not just typhoons, highly contagious diseases, and fires. And the most important thing is the 5 Japanese thugs who bullied Grace. These 5 Japanese gangsters have not entered the country yet. Once they enter the country, Johnson will deal with them one by one. Apart from Grace, Johnson's own situation is not optimistic. The 1983 crackdown was about to begin. As the leader of the gangs in Lujia village, Johnson knew that he would definitely be listed as an example. How to break the impasse is Johnson's biggest difficulty at the moment. Ponder for a moment. Johnson believes that the key to breaking the deadlock lies in Tang Gong's daughter Tang Shushu. In her previous life, this woman was a ruthless character. Smart, hardworking, and upright. When he was young, Johnson once forcibly kissed Tang Shushu in front of the whole village. After that, Tang Shushu went to study abroad. After returning from his studies 3 years later, he was soon promoted to a cadre in the village, in charge of disciplinary inspection work. If he could leave a good impression with her, it would be a great help in helping Johnson get rid of the image of a gangster and bully. Johnson vaguely remembered that Tang Shushu went abroad not only to study, but also to practice Japanese karate. Although he was stabbed to death by Johnson that year, that bit of kung fu still left some impression on him. While Johnson was lost in thought, Tang Shushu, who was at the intersection, slowly walked towards the courtyard, her eyes fixed on Johnson. This was the man who had forcefully kissed her in front of the whole village. Tang Shushu will never forget it in his life. Pooh! Tang Shushu felt sick when he thought about being kissed by this gangster bully. If she hadn't been kissed by Johnson and hadn't been criticized in the village, she wouldn't have gone to study in another place. Of course, you won't be able to learn advanced kung fu like karate. She practiced karate for 3 years just for this day. Johnson is a scumbag. Scum. Not only did she withhold her father's salary, she also didn't even write him an IOU. Not only did she not give him an IOU, she also forced her father to work everywhere. As a result, her father now wants to marry her to a rich man so that he can save money for his younger brother to get married. Tang Shushu was getting closer and closer. Johnson could sense the murderous intent. His battle instinct pulled him out of his contemplation. Johnson smiled and looked at Tang Shushu in the distance. Tang Shushu put his glasses in his pocket and glared at Johnson. Johnson, have you ever thought that one day you will be defeated by me? Tang Shushu was 8 feet away from Johnson, squinting his eyes and speaking to him. Johnson smiled, haha no. While the two were talking, Michael also saw Tang Shushu on the roof and called a group of brothers to the gate of the courtyard. A group of big men stood behind Johnson. Michael stood behind Johnson, and Tang Shushu was the only one standing opposite. Hey, isn't this our Shushu? Back then, she was kissed by our eldest brother and left Lujia village out of shame. How could she bear to come back? Does she miss our eldest brother? Haha, now I understand what Michael said. It turns out you were thinking about our brother Johnson. Ha! Michael and a group of strong men teased Tang Shushu, and Tang Shushu was so angry that he was shaking all over. Johnson, do you dare to challenge me one-on-one? Don't always rely on your numbers. Tang Shushu gritted her teeth and said that even though she had taken off her glasses, she couldn't see clearly. There must be at least 20 big men, and she would definitely not get the upper hand in a group fight. After listening to what Tang Shushu said, Michael stood directly in front of Johnson and asked to fight. But Johnson didn't agree. He took 2 steps forward and hooked his finger at Tang Shushu. Tang Shushu then took a karate stance, looking extremely professional. Michael whispered to Johnson, "Brother, this little girl is not simple. She is rarely matched in the karate hall in the county. Be careful not to fall into her trap." Johnson smiled and stood in the open space. Tang Shushu got ready. His eyes became extremely sharp and rushed towards Johnson. Watch this. Tang Shushu is extremely fast, and Taekwondo is all about killing with one strike. Tang Shushu ran to less than 2 meters away from Johnson. Tang Shushu leaped into the air, turned 360 degrees. A 360-degree spinning kick. Drink! With a loud shout, Tang Shushu's roundhouse kick hit Johnson's neck. Tang Shushu was delighted. Done. Even their gym leader won't be able to withstand this kick. What's more, this is a reckless man who has never learned kung fu. Bang! With a dull thud, Tang Shushu's roundhouse kick landed squarely on Johnson's neck. Tang Shushu was overjoyed. Now she just needs to control the strength of landing. The moment she hits the ground, Johnson will fall to the ground and foam at the mouth. But things didn't turn out as she wished. Tang Shushu did not land safely, but was lifted up upside down instead. Ah, ah. Tang Shushu was being carried upside down, looking at Johnson in front of him in horror. Impossible. This move is a spinning kick. It clearly hit the neck, which is an extremely vulnerable spot. One hit will knock him down. Why does Johnson act like nothing happened? You let me go. You let me go. Tang Shushu stuga lao det poten. Johnson stretched his neck, threw Tang Shushu out, and then stretched his body. After Tang Shushu was thrown out, her shoes fell off, but she didn't care. She got up and rushed towards Johnson again. Drink! Tang Shushu threw another roundhouse kick. This time, she kicked Johnson's neck on the other side. She doesn't believe it. Is Johnson really that strong? But this time, she didn't even have the chance to run into Johnson. Johnson grabbed his calf in the air and lifted him upside down. Tang Shushu's white little feet were held by Johnson, who looked at her with a smile. The 20 big men around Johnson also burst into laughter. Shushu, you still need to practice, Johnson said with a smile. Huh, Tang Shushu, what kind of skills did you learn? Why are they useless? Isn't this a waste of tuition? Is it possible that Tang Shushu learned the gangster's exciting punch? Tang Shushu's face turned red as she was teased by the group of big men, but Johnson was still holding her little feet. Tang Shushu said angrily, Johnson, put me down, put me down. At this time, Engineer Tang, who was repairing the roof, also noticed the situation here. He saw that it was his daughter who came to trouble Johnson. He quickly took the account book and envelope and ran to the gate of the courtyard. Chapter 27. Tang Shushu admitted his mistake. At the gate of the courtyard, Johnson was holding Tang Shushu's feet. Tang Shushu was struggling. The burly men under Johnson were grinning and laughing. You bastard! Don't touch my feet! Let me go! Johnson angrily. But Johnson had no intention of letting go and still held her white feet. Tang Shushu was held upside down, no matter how he struggled. No one can escape Johnson's grasp. This shocked Tang Shushu extremely. Even in the karate gym, she had never felt so aggrieved. Could it be that Johnson's strength is stronger than everyone else in the gym? Impossible. She grew up following Johnson. Johnson's ability's best. He has never learned kung fu. How can it be so powerful? Just when Tang Shushu was thinking about where Johnson learned kung fu, Tang Gong ran out of the courtyard and saw Tang Shushu being dragged by Johnson, and he quickly pleaded for Tang Shushu. Johnson saw Tang Gong coming out to plead for mercy. He thought for a moment, and then let Tang Shushu go. After Tang Shushu was put down, he wanted to challenge Johnson, but was pulled away by Engineer Tang, who looked very serious. What are you doing, girl? You cause trouble for Dad as soon as you come back. Can't you just be quiet for a while? Mr. Tang pointed at Tang Shushu's nose and scolded him. Tang Shushu stamped his feet. Dad, how am I causing trouble? I'm here to get revenge. He kissed me in front of the whole village, so I must seek revenge on him. And look, he even touched my foot today. This stinky hooligan hasn't changed at all. Hearing what Tang Shushu said, Tang Gong scolded in a low voice. What revenge? When you were a kid, you played behind people all day long and couldn't be chased away. Didn't you like Johnson in your heart? After he kissed you, weren't you happy for a long time? After he finished speaking, Tang Gong paused and said, I saw it all this time. Your shoes fell off by yourself. Don't blame the boss. Besides, the boss's hands were very honest the whole time. He only grabbed your calf and didn't act like a hooligan. After hearing this, Tang Shushu felt so aggrieved that he stomped his feet in anger. Of course, she knew Johnson wasn't being rude to her, but she couldn't swallow this. Because Johnson kissed her in front of the whole village. She thought he wanted to date her, but Johnson didn't have that intention at all, and her first kiss was taken away for nothing. This is where Tang Shushu's spirit shines. After scolding Tang Shushu, Tang Gong was about to leave the hillside and go back to repair the roof. Tang Shushu chased him out, but Johnson and a group of big men had returned to the courtyard, leaving Tang Gong and Tang Shushu alone in front of the courtyard gate. Tang Shushu pointed at Johnson in the yard and looked at Tang Gong. Dad, why do you always speak for him? And you work for him? He hasn't paid our bills for a year. We can't even afford to eat. Mom is going to kick you out of the house. Don't you know that? Tang Shushu became more and more angry as he spoke. This bully Johnson not only owes workers' wages, but also refuses to issue IOUs. When she becomes a village official, the first person she will deal with is him. When Tang Gong heard what Tang Shushu said, he slapped his forehead, took out the account book and envelope from his pocket, and handed them to Tang Shushu. How could I have forgotten about this? Shushu, the boss has to pay us. Mr. Tang grinned so hard that wrinkles appeared at the corners of his eyes. Tang Shushu hadn't seen Tang Gong laugh so sincerely for many years. After taking the account book and envelope, Tang Shushu opened them suspiciously. After opening the envelope, Tang Shushu was stunned. There's a wad of money in the envelope. $38.24. Tang Shushu knew the amount of money without even opening the account book. Because his father once left his account book at home, she calculated it carefully and based on the highest interest rate. Not a single point off. Slowly, the corners of Tang Shushu's mouth began to tremble, and mist appeared in his eyes. Suddenly, Tang Shushu squatted on the ground and started crying. Woo! Woo! Tang Shushu's behavior frightened Tang Gong, who quickly said, Shushu, what's wrong with you? It's a good thing that the boss paid us. Why are you crying? After hearing what Tang Gong said, Tang Shushu cried even harder, with tears falling down her face. Do you know how I spent the past 3 years? In order to catch Johnson, I learned karate and law. I did everything that others were unwilling to do. I helped the teacher with everything he needed help with. I studied until very late every day and got up every morning to practice. I suffered so much. And then you tell me that Johnson is not a bad guy. Tang Shushu squatted on the ground with tears all over her face. Tang Gong also squatted on the ground and gently patted Tang Shushu's back. Shushu, your efforts have not been in vain. Dad is proud of you. You were not born to catch Johnson. The village is so poor now, and you are an intellectual. You should work for the welfare of the villagers. Johnson in the courtyard. Shushu, Dad has always believed that what a person does is not what he says. This morning, the boss made breakfast and lunch for his wife and children. Just now, he repeatedly told me to fix the roof so that his wife and daughter would not get wet. He almost turned the roof into a bunker. Do you think such a person can be a bad person? Tang Shushu nodded. Then I'll go apologize to Johnson. I misunderstood him. As Tang Shushu spoke, he walked into the courtyard. Johnson was standing in the middle of the yard, and the burly men beside him were helping the construction team. After Tang Shushu walked into the courtyard, he stood next to Johnson like a piece of wood with a tense expression. The burly men in the yard looked at Tang Shushu suspiciously, like wooden sticks, and didn't say a word. Johnson asked in confusion, What's wrong with you? No, it's okay. After Tang Shushu finished speaking, she bit her lips tightly. She is a person with strong self-esteem. After 3 years of suffering, I had already imagined Johnson to be the world's #1 bully. Johnson has changed in style. Tang Shushu still found it a little hard to accept. Tang Shushu stood next to Johnson. He adjusted his glasses stiffly. Sorry. Tang Shushu's apology made the whole courtyard fall silent. The burly men in the courtyard stopped their work and looked at Tang Shushu. Johnson pretended not to hear. A group of big men looked at Tang Shushu with smiles. This made Tang Shushu's face slightly red. She seldom apologizes to others on her own initiative. Johnson pondered for a moment, a wicked smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. What did you say? It was so chaotic just now that I couldn't hear clearly. When Tang Shushu heard what Johnson said, he was so angry that his teeth were itching. In addition, so many people stopped working and looked at them, which made Tang Shushu feel even more embarrassed. Tang Shushu gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. Johnson, I said, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Speak louder. Who can hear this noise? Johnson said with a smirk. Ha ha ha. Shushu, say it again. We haven't heard enough. The big men looked at Tang Shushu's red face and started laughing. Rogue scoundrel. Tang Shushu was so angry that he stamped his feet, glared at Johnson and the group of big men, turned around and walked out of the courtyard. But Johnson's next words made Tang Shushu turn back quickly. Johnson looked at the big men in the courtyard. Ponder for a moment. He opened his mouth slowly. People outside say that we are the #1 gang in Lujia village, but I don't think so. We have reformed. But tell me, who made so many of us reform? Who has such great ability? After finishing speaking, Johnson took the opportunity to control the atmosphere and continued. This person is very capable. If the village knew about this, he would definitely be promoted to a cadre. Maybe he would even be noticed by the county and become a county cadre. After finishing speaking, Johnson continued with a look of pain. Alas, such a good opportunity to make a contribution is wasted like this. Tang Shushu had already walked to the door, but when he heard Johnson's words, he quickly turned back, his eyes lighting up. Brother Johnson, you see, can I do this? Don't waste such a good opportunity Give it to me. Tang Shushu even changed the way he addressed Johnson. You? Can you do it? There are so many of us. Can you change us? Will others believe it if you tell them? Johnson smiled. Tang Shushu nodded very seriously. I've been studying law and politics outside for the past 3 years. I can do it. If not, let me give you 2 ideological and political classes, and let's try it first. Johnson thought for a moment. Then he said, okay, then come to my house tomorrow night. I'll call some brothers over, and you can give them 2 lessons and try. Okay, it just so happens that I haven't seen Sister Grace for a long time, and I still have a lot of questions about cultural subjects that I don't understand and want to ask her. After Tang Shushu finished speaking, Michael came in from the gate of the courtyard, followed by a group of brothers. Johnson asked Michael to prepare yesterday. After everyone was gathered, Johnson led his brothers to the silk reeling factory. Meanwhile, in the office of the workshop director of the silk reeling factory, Grace was lying unconscious on the sofa. Not far away, Susan was unbuckling her belt. Chapter 28. Johnson arrives. In the workshop director's office of the silk reeling factory, Susan untied her belt in a lewd manner. Grace was unconscious, lying on her side on the leather sofa. The buttons on her clothes had broken. Her tight pants outlined a perfect curve, and her shoes had been taken off. Susan walked to the sofa and looked at Grace as profile. Why didn't he cherish such a beautiful woman? If they hadn't broken up, they would have gotten married. Grace no longer has to suffer beatings every day and live such a hard life. And Susan was certain that if he married Grace, his nightlife would be extremely colorful. Originally, Susan had prepared many things to threaten Grace. For example, he used the fact that he had dated Grace to threaten Grace into submission. If Grace refuses, he still has a backup plan. For example, the underwear thing. For example, when the county leaders were inspecting the factory, he could use reporting Johnson as an example to threaten her. But none of these were used. Grace just fainted on the sofa. Susan couldn't bear it any longer. Started to make moves on Grace. Just when Susan was in high spirits, Susan could hear the roar of the silk reeling machines. Grace's voice came. Grace stood beside the desk in the office, looking at Susan with confusion, who had a lewd look on her face. Susan leaned against the door with her back, locked it, and began to fantasize. Director Young, what are you daydreaming about? Why did you lock the door? Where are the test questions you mentioned? Why can't I see them? Grace's voice brought Susan back to reality. This wasn't the first time he had fantasized about doing that with Grace. It's just a fantasy. He has the desire but not the courage to do it. Susan, who was pulled back to the real world, smiled awkwardly, walked to the table, and rummaged through the drawer. Grace also helped Susan find the test questions. Oh no, Grace. I just remembered that the test paper was left at my house, Susan said with some guilt. Hearing Susan's words, Grace frowned slightly. In your house? Yes. The county leaders had dinner at my house yesterday. It was left at my house. I should have returned it to the leaders, but now it seems that they are not in a hurry. It's okay to delay it for another day. How about you come to my house tonight and take a look? Susan spoke. She looked at Grace's body in a very obscene way. Without waiting for Grace to reply, Susan walked to the cupboard and took out a small bag from the corner of the cupboard, which contained a pink bra. When Grace saw the bra, her brows furrowed even more. Director Young, what are you going to do? Susan quickly apologized with a smile and explained. Grace, don't get me wrong, this bra is not mine. It was given to you by the factory director's wife. You know the factory director's wife always buys famous brands, and this bra is very expensive. The factory director's wife meant for you to try it on when you go back. If it fits you, you can keep it. If it doesn't fit, you can return it. After saying this, Susan paused for a moment. Grace, what I mean is that you take it back and try it on. If it fits you, then wear it. If it doesn't fit, just return it to me when you come to my house tonight to look at the test papers. Grace refused coldly. Director Young, please thank the director's wife for me. I have underwear. I won't go to your house tonight. Susan smiled and put the underwear into a high-end bag. Don't reject me yet. I guess Johnson doesn't know that we were in a relationship. Grace frowned, her expression very serious. Director Young, is that also called dating? Isn't that just a blind date arranged by your family? I never agreed to date you. Seeing Grace's chest heaving with anger, Susan showed a hint of amusement. The fact is, we did meet alone. We didn't need to do anything, just meeting alone. Plus, you didn't tell him. Johnson would beat you to death. Think about it. Isn't that the truth? Grace turned pale after hearing this. Susan made a good point. Johnson, if he knew he had gone out alone with other men before, She will definitely be beaten to death. Grace did not mention this to Johnson. Grace clenched her fists and bit her lips. Susan left her desk with a lewd smile on her face. While laughing, Susan walked out of the office door. Grace, let's do this. I know your life is not easy. Today, the county leaders are here to inspect and are holding a meeting in the factory director's office. I will report Johnson right away and have the county leaders send him to jail. This way, you will be free. No. Grace heard that Susan was going to report Johnson. She immediately blocked the office door and stood in front of Susan. Grace said nervously, "You don't report Johnson." She knew very well that the county leaders came to Lujia village for two reasons. One was the typhoon, and the other was to catch an example. Susan looked at Grace in front of her. She had a beautiful appearance and figure, and she almost couldn't hold back. But he still didn't have the courage to bully the female workers in the factory. So Susan smiled playfully and said, "It's okay not to report him. What specific reason can stop me from reporting Johnson? Come to my house tonight to talk about it. By the way, take a look at the test questions. You worked so hard for so long, just for the adult college entrance examination, didn't you?" Grace was silent, clenching her teeth tightly. Susan whispered softly into Grace's ear, her voice very obscene. "I heard that Johnson beat up Daniel's family yesterday and injured them badly. If I go out and report it to the county leaders, Johnson will be sentenced to death." Grace shuddered, and then her face turned pale. My breathing also became rapid. Grace clenched her teeth tightly and squeezed out a few words. I'll go." Seeing that Grace had given in, Susan walked back to her desk from the office door and stuffed the high-end underwear into Grace's hands. Grace held the high-end underwear in her hands and trembled helplessly. "That's right, Grace. Wear it and come to see me in the evening. We can have a good chat and discuss some literary issues. I'm studying biology recently, so if there's anything I don't understand, I need your help." "Well," Grace nodded, then bit her lip and said, "Director Young, you can only chat and look at questions. You can't do anything else. I have a man." Susan smiled obscenely. "Look at what you said. What are you thinking about? I'm not that kind of person. I just want to chat and look at the questions. I won't do anything else. If you come tonight and report Johnson, I will forget about it completely." Grace nodded. Grace was a little absent-minded and was about to leave the office. Susan added something else before Grace left. "Grace, the test questions and the report are highly confidential, so don't let anyone know. You can come alone at night. If too many people come, I can't guarantee that they will go to the county leaders. Oh, by the way, go back and prepare. I'll give you a day off." Susan looked at Grace's beautiful back and smiled obscenely. He was already fantasizing about the evening. Grace left the office in a daze, not even noticing that many female workers were eavesdropping on their conversation outside the door. She was shivering as she walked, tears welling up in her eyes. She felt cold all over and very helpless. If she went there at night, who knows what would happen? If she didn't go that night, Susan would definitely report Johnson. She didn't want Johnson to be taken away. Grace, with red eyes, was walking home with Angela in her arms. When she looked up, she bumped into Johnson, who was rushing to the silk reeling factory. Chapter 29. She'll do anything for you. Grace, holding Angela, ran into Johnson at the entrance of the alley. Johnson was followed by a group of people, including Michael, Tang Shushu, Emma, and others. Grace saw Johnson head on. She took Angela and hid at the entrance of the alley while Johnson and the others were chatting and didn't see her. As soon as she hid in the alley, Grace burst into tears of grievance. She covered her mouth gently. Angela, who was next to her, saw Grace crying and started crying too. Grace hugged Angela and cried helplessly. She really had no other choice. To prevent Johnson from being captured, she could only go to his house to see him at night wearing the high-end lingerie Susan gave her. This cannot be told to Johnson. If Johnson knew, she must be beaten to death. Johnson and his brothers left. Grace walked out of the alley, her eyes red and swollen, her body shaking, and she went home in a daze. Johnson, Michael, Tang Shushu, Emma, and others stopped at the entrance of the alley. Johnson turned around and looked at Grace's back. Look at her distraught look. Johnson was heartbroken. Eyes are red. Johnson took a deep breath, ready to catch up with Grace. But Emma stopped him. "Brother, don't go. Sister-in-law is hiding from you. She definitely doesn't want you to know. She is really scared of you beating her. She won't dare to tell you even if you ask her. Sister-in-law is pregnant and can't be frightened. Let me go see sister-in-law." Emma also looked at Grace walking away with great heartache. Johnson took a deep breath. Okay, Emma, please help me check on Grace. Grace's sobs at the entrance of the alley were like knives. One by one, they stabbed his heart. Johnson thought for a moment. Shoo, go to the silk reeling factory and ask around to find out what happened to Grace. After listening to this, Tang Shushu nodded and looked at Emma. The two women went their separate ways. One went to find Grace, and the other went to the silk reeling factory. About 20 minutes later, Emma returned to the entrance of the alley, holding a high-end shopping bag. Johnson and Michael were at the end of the alley, and Johnson looked tense. Emma opened the high-end shopping bag and showed it to Johnson. There was a pink high-end bra inside, and even the tag was still on. Brother, Susan asked her to wear this underwear and go to his house to see him at night. Hearing Emma's words, Johnson's eyes became extremely cold. After Emma finished speaking, she paused for a moment and continued. My sister-in-law doesn't want to go, but Susan said that if she doesn't agree, she will report you to the county leaders, and you will be sentenced to death. Johnson was silent after listening to this. Take a deep breath. Brother, I can see that sister-in-law really loves you with her life. For you, she could do anything. Sister-in-law didn't let me tell you that she really just wanted to do something for you. Brother, don't hit sister-in-law anymore. She really loves you. Yeah, I know. After listening to what Emma said, Johnson nodded heavily. Soon, while Emma and Johnson were talking, Tang Shushu came back with a stack of letters of denunciation in his hand. After Tang Shushu came back, he immediately reported the situation to Johnson, which was consistent with what Emma had found out. Moreover, there are many female workers in the silk reeling factory, so they can hear more detailed information. Today, Susan tricked Grace into the office and locked the door. The female workers outside overheard Susan threatening Grace. This is not the first time Susan has harassed Sister Grace. It has happened several times. After Tang Shushu finished speaking, he looked at the letters of complaint in his hand. These were all letters of complaint jointly written by the female workers who had been harassed by Su Shanshan. And Sister Grace is exceptionally beautiful and has a great figure. I was harassed more often. Sister Grace didn't dare tell Johnson. Because one time Johnson was drunk, Sister Grace told the story. Johnson went to the factory to cause trouble, but was kicked out by 3 security guards. He felt so frustrated that he had no place to vent his anger, so he almost beat Sister Grace to death when he came back. Brother Johnson, please stop hitting Sister Grace. Sister Grace doesn't want to be harassed by Susan. She's also in pain. She's also trying to support her family. I see. Johnson took a deep breath. Walking towards the silk reeling factory with a gloomy face, Johnson's eyes were extremely cold. Johnson, every step. The face will become more and more hideous, and the temperature in Lujia village will drop sharply. Michael, Emma, Tang Shushu, and others felt a biting cold that they had never felt before. They have an illusion. Johnson dragged the entire Lujia village into the cold winter. On the other side, after Grace left with Angela, Susan came to the factory director's office. Factory director Yang Shunshue was talking to the leaders, and when he saw Susan, he walked out of the office. Susan pulled Yang Shunshue to the tea room. Before Susan could speak, Yang Shunshue spoke first in a hurry. Is it done? Grace agrees. After Yang Shunshue finished speaking, Su Shanshan smiled obscenely and said, It's done. She agreed. We can do it tonight. Tonight? What are you going to do? Didn't I say tomorrow? Today is not possible. I have to accompany the county leaders for dinner. There is also a typhoon emergency drill in the evening. I can't leave. Ask her to change the time and come to serve me tomorrow night. After Yang Shunshue finished his instructions, he returned to the office to chat with the county leaders. Tomorrow night? Tomorrow night. I'll hand Grace over to you. Will there be a share for me? I also want to taste the taste of the most beautiful woman in the silk reeling factory. Haha, she's not a virgin anyway. I'll eat her up tonight and force her to submit again tomorrow night. Su Shanshan hummed obscenely, left the silk reeling factory, and went to the county's foreign trade city. There was a small passage in the foreign trade city that was smoked black, and all the goods in it were for adults. Susan walked around the aisle and pointed at a pair of socks at the stall at the front of the aisle. Is it strong? The stall owner smiled and said, Sturdy and durable. No snagging, no fading. These are all foreign trade products. Susan pouted. I don't like strong ones. I like ones that can be torn apart easily. After that, he paid and bought 2 pairs of socks, one black and one flesh-colored. Then he walked to the middle of the aisle and found the hedging tools and Wei Gu at a stall. Susan first bought a box of hedging tools, then picked up a box of Viagra and looked at it carefully. Grace's neighbors all said that Johnson could torture Grace for 1 or 2 hours a night. He couldn't lose either, in case he failed right after entering the room at night. Wouldn't that be embarrassing? This is very possible, considering Grace is so beautiful and has a great figure. It must be very comfortable. He couldn't surrender too soon. Boss, will this last? You will know after you try it. After you buy it for the first time, I guarantee you will come back for more. This is a secret recipe passed down from my ancestors. I used it to cure my husband completely. You can buy it without worry. Susan paid the money in a lewd manner and walked to the end of the passage. In front of the stall at the end of the passage, there was a big man with a pair of black and blue eyes, as if he had been beaten. The stall was labeled knockout drug. "Biao, give me a box of knockout pills, and a strong one." The last box didn't work, it was too weak. Susan smiled obscenely. After listening to him, Lu Dabiao immediately understood what he meant, then looked around carefully and took out a beautifully packaged box from a Japanese-style box. "Director Yang, I recently bought a batch of Japanese products. They are very strong. As long as she eats them, she will do whatever you ask her to do. This is the price." After some bargaining, Susan spent a month's salary with a painful look on her face to buy a box of Japanese goods. Susan finished shopping. She packed all her supplies in a black bag and went home. When he got home and opened the door, Susan had a lewd smile on her face. He put the black bag containing the socks, the escape tools, Viagra, and the knockout drug on the kitchen table and hummed a little tune. But he didn't notice that there was a man sitting next to the table. At this moment, the black bag was not placed firmly and fell to the ground. Socks, hedging tools, Viagra, and knockout drugs were scattered all over the floor. One of the knockout drugs rolled to the side of the table. Susan lay on the floor, smiling obscenely as she tried to pick it up. Before she could pick it up, a leather shoe fell on the knockout drug. Susan looked up along the leather shoes. Just happened to meet a pair of eyes glowing green. Those eyes, staring at him intently. Chapter 30, you like to read questions, right? The socks, shelter tools, Wei-gu, and knockout drugs in the black plastic bag fell from the kitchen table. Susan got down on the floor and picked up the items one by one, and finally picked up the knockout pills on the table, with a lewd expression on her face. Johnson, on the other hand, stepped on the knockout pills, his eyes wide open, veins popping out on his forehead. Looking up along the pair of leather shoes, Susan met Johnson's eyes that sent chills down her spine. Susan was holding a bunch of adult products in her arms, and she didn't know how to explain for a moment. This Johnson is a well-known bully. "Brother Johnson, listen to me, it's not what you think." "Ah!" Susan let out a scream. Johnson kicked Susan onto the kitchen next to the door. The glass in the kitchen shattered, and several steamed buns fell out. The exam file on the kitchen also fell to the ground. Susan grimaced in pain. Johnson picked up the steamed bread on the ground, which was still covered with broken glass, directly into Susan's mouth. "Whoa, whoa, whoa." Susan struggled in pain. "I remember the steamed bread you gave Grace was taken from near your thing. You like to eat steamed bread, right?" Johnson stuffed the entire steamed bun into Susan's mouth, choking her so much that tears and snot ran down her face. Just when Susan was about to suffocate, Johnson punched Susan in the stomach, causing the steamed bread in Susan's mouth to come out, and the broken glass made his mouth full of blood foam. "Brother Johnson, it's not what you think," Susan explained while enduring the pain. Johnson smiled coldly. "Director Yang, you like to chat up my wife, right? Do you like my way of chatting up?" Before Susan could speak, Johnson picked up the test paper file on the ground and used it to hit Susan's face. Susan was so scared that she didn't dare to look up. Johnson slapped Susan in the face. "You just like to look at the questions, right? Come on, look, show me." Susan was beaten by Johnson until she was shaking. She begged for mercy. "I don't want to watch it anymore. I don't want to watch it anymore. Please don't beat me anymore." Susan begged for mercy and moved towards the door, trying to run out of the house. At this time, a group of people came in from outside. The one in front was Michael. Michael walked to Susan and whispered in her ear, "Director Yang, you know that my life was saved by my elder brother. As long as my elder brother nods, I can trade 1 for 1 with you." Michael finished speaking. He stood behind Johnson and stood beside Johnson respectfully. The other big men also stood behind Johnson respectfully. Susan was horrified after hearing what Michael said. Of course, he knew about the relationship between Michael and Johnson. Michael would absolutely risk his life for Johnson. No one in the village doesn't know it. At this time, another person walked in. A well-mannered girl, holding a bunch of joint letters of denunciation from female workers in the silk reeling factory. This person was Tang Shushu. When Susan saw Tang Shushu, she desperately crawled towards him. This is the future village cadre. Tang Shushu. Save me, save me. These bullies beat me. But before Susan could finish her words, Tang Shushu's next move made Susan feel cold all over, from head to toe. Click sound. Tang Shushu leaned against the door and locked it. Then he looked at Susan coldly and stood respectfully behind Johnson, just like Michael. Brother Johnson, everyone outside is ready. Emma is standing guard outside. Tang Shushu bowed and spoke to Johnson with great respect. Seeing this, Susan was completely dumbfounded. What's going on? Why Michael, that ruthless man, was so respectful to Johnson? But why? Why is Tang Shushu, the future village cadre, so respectful to Johnson? And Johnson seemed different too. What on earth happened to him? Shock. Panic. It lingered in Susan's mind. Michael, Tang Shushu, and others stood behind Johnson. Johnson squatted in front of Susan and laughed playfully. Susan was so scared that she trembled. Director Young, I heard that you and Grace were in a relationship? Johnson finished speaking. Susan's head began to shake like a rattle. No, absolutely not. Don't listen to what others say. It was just a blind date. We only met once. Grace didn't agree to me. We didn't do anything. Johnson smiled coldly and slapped him. Who can prove it? Susan could explain. Johnson slapped her twice, causing Susan to lose 2 of her teeth. Someone can prove it. Grace's cousin and sister-in-law can prove it. At that time, she was helping in the kitchen in her cousin's restaurant. I went to the restaurant to meet her, but she didn't agree, so I left. I was wrong. I shouldn't have used the fact that I was in a relationship with her to threaten her. After listening to this, Johnson narrowed his eyes and his face darkened. Have you ever considered Grace as feelings? Do you know how helpless she was at that time? Michael, who was standing next to him, saw that Johnson had narrowed his eyes. Before Johnson could make any move, he grabbed Susan's head and pushed her into the kitchen, pushing Susan's head deep into the kitchen cabinet. Susan's mouth and nose were pressed against the smelly rag inside, and she was struggling helplessly. Woo-woo, woo-woo. Susan buried her head in the cupboard, trying to get out. Johnson smiled coldly. Director Young, don't you usually like to get into Grace's closet? Why do you dislike your own closet so much? Stay in there for a while. Whoa, I was wrong. Johnson snorted coldly and kicked Susan hard on the butt. Then, Johnson walked to the table and sat down. The table was filled with joint letters of complaint from female workers in the silk reeling factory. Tang Shushu was standing at the side and back. Michael dragged Susan out of the kitchen and pulled her to kneel in front of the table. Johnson picked up a joint letter of complaint on the table, glanced at Tang Shushu, and finally fixed his eyes on Susan. Director Yang, Shushu is here too. Didn't you tell Grace that you wanted to report me? Go ahead. Shushu is a future village cadre. Let's get started. Brother Johnson, I don't dare anymore. I really know I was wrong. Please let me go. I won't report you. Johnson sneered, opened the joint letter of complaint from the female workers in the silk reeling factory, and handed it to Tang Shushu. After Tang Shushu took the letter of complaint, he read it word by word. After he finished reading, everyone in the room looked at Susan with disgust. Tang Shushu gritted his teeth and said, Susan, you are the only one who reported others? More than 20 female workers in the factory exposed you to me. You are such a beast. How many decent women have you abused in the past few years? Do you still have any shame? If Brother Johnson hadn't found out today, would you have abused Sister Grace tonight? Aye. Susan looked at the densely packed letters of complaint on the table, all written by the female workers he had abused. Speechless. Before Susan could say anything, Tang Shushu slapped Susan in the face. I'll catch you first. Susan hung her head like a deflated ball. Just what Johnson said next. Susan was shocked. I felt an immense fear from the bottom of my heart. Johnson was the only one sitting in the room. He pointed at the socks, hedging tools, Viagra, and knockout drugs on the table. He looked at Susan fiercely, and Susan collapsed to the ground in fear. Tell me, are you going to use these 4 things on Grace tonight? Chapter 31. Director Yang, your leg hair is quite thick. Susan was kneeling on the ground, and on the table were the adult products he had bought from the foreign trade city. 2 pairs of socks, 1 black and 1 flesh-colored, 2 boxes of hedging tools, a box of powerful Viagra, and a box of expensive neon country knockout drugs. Johnson's eyes were filled with endless anger. Michael held the sharp knife across Susan's neck. Susan had no doubts. All Johnson had to do was look at her. Michael would cut his neck. The blade on the neck went deeper and deeper. Susan could feel a trickle of blood flowing onto her collar. Johnson, who was not far away, had no hesitation in his eyes. It seemed as if he was going to be killed today, just as Michael was about to stab Susan's neck. Susan gritted her teeth and said, These 4 things, they are not for Grace." After saying this, Susan squeezed out a few more words from between her teeth. "Yes, I bought them for myself. I take them myself. I usually like to wear long socks and take these pills." Susan said this. Everyone in the room laughed. A group of big men grinned at Susan. Tang Shushu looked at Susan with contempt. Michael smiled coldly, but only Johnson's eyes were still extremely cold, without a trace of smile on his face. Michael saw that Johnson was serious. His eyes turned cold. He went up and slapped Susan on the mouth. "Who the hell are you fooling?" "Ouch." "Ouch." Susan's half face was twitching in pain. Susan covered her burning face and continued to defend herself. "Brother Johnson, seriously, I'm just a bit of a jerk. I just love these things. I'm usually so cute. Those pills are so delicious." Susan finished speaking. Michael turned around and was about to slap her again. Before the slap was about to land, Johnson gently waved his hand to stop it. Johnson sat on a stool, picked up the socks, hedging tools, Viagra, and knockout drugs on the table, and threw them at Susan's face. Susan didn't dare to hide and shivered in pain. "You like to use it yourself, don't you? Come on, show it to me." There was still no smile on Johnson's face. His face was frighteningly cold, causing the temperature of the entire room to drop a few degrees. Johnson said. Tang Shushu gently adjusted his glasses, then turned his back and didn't look at Susan. "Okay, I'll show you." Susan finished speaking. She tremblingly took off her pants and picked up a pair of flesh-colored stockings. Michael smiled playfully and picked up another pair of black stockings. "Hey, Director Yang, do you like flesh-colored ones? The brothers don't like them very much. We like black ones. You wear this one." "Okay, since the brothers like it, then I'll wear black." After hearing what Susan said, Tang Shushu turned his back and felt so nauseous that he almost vomited. Soon, Susan put on black stockings, and her thick leg hair stuck out from the stockings one by one, like a pod of black cactus. Michael found a pair of tweezers and plucked out the sticking leg hair one by one. "Director Yang, your leg hair is quite abundant." "Ouch. Ouch, ouch. Brother Dao, stop pulling it out. It hurts so much." "Ouch, ouch, dash." Susan finished yelling. There was a hissing sound from the black stockings. When Michael was pulling out his leg hair, the stockings were torn. A piece of flesh was exposed, which was covered with leg hair, and then Michael began to pull out the leg hair from this piece of flesh. "Director Yang, whose stockings are these? What's the quality? You are so rich. Why don't you buy better quality ones? I will shave all the exposed leg hair for you. Don't thank me. You like to wear black stockings? I like to pluck thigh hair. This is called fate." "Ouch. Ouch, ouch, ouch." Susan grimaced in pain and trembled all over, but when she saw Johnson's murderous eyes, she dared not scream and could only cover her mouth and endure it. Susan was so regretful. Why didn't she listen to the stall owner and buy a better quality one? After plucking the hair from her legs, Johnson still looked cold, and Michael saw this and directly grabbed a handful of knockout drugs and Wei-Go, pinched Susan's mouth and poured water into her mouth. "Galululu, galululu. Cough, 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 cough." Susan was coughing and vomiting violently and asked Michael while vomiting, "Brother Dao, how much did you give me? How much did you give me to eat?" "Not much, just a box of Wei-Go and a box of knockout pills." Susan was shocked. A box of Viagra. A box of knockout pills. Normally 1 pill is enough. Will this box kill him? Susan was just thinking about it when she suddenly had an idea. I covered my face embarrassedly. Tang Shushu accidentally turned his head back and quickly turned his head back, retching in disgust. Michael kicked Susan in the lower body. "You're the only one who wants to use this thing against your sister-in-law, right?" Ah, ah. Susan covered her lower body and howled. Michael's kick almost killed her. Susan rolled back and forth on the ground in pain. Susan is now regretting why she wanted to take advantage of Grace. After rolling on the ground for a while, Susan rolled to the door. He gritted his teeth, stood up suddenly, opened the locked door, and ran out. At this time, outside the door, Emma led half of the villagers to gather at his door, looking at Susan in black socks with great surprise. "Ro! Abnormal! Director Yang is a pervert. Come and see. Shame on you. What the hell?" Susan saw that people were watching her. She quickly went back into the house and hid. Johnson still looked cold. He sat up from his chair, picked up the test paper on the ground, and found the biology subject. Susan squatted at the foot of the wall, trembling with fear. Johnson squatted beside Susan, a hint of amusement finally appearing at the corner of his mouth. Director Young, I heard that you want to exchange literature and study biology recently. I have called all the villagers who love learning here. Come out, learn from each other, and make progress together. Johnson opened the door. Susan was wearing black socks with a few unplucked hairs sticking out. She covered them up shyly, holding the biology test paper in her hand, and walked out the door. Outside, there was a group of Lujia village villagers with their mouths wide open, shocked beyond words. Chapter 32 Director Yang is surrounded by crazy onlookers. Susan walked out of the door, tremblingly, wearing adult products. The villagers around looked at Susan with contempt. Emma took out a high-end shopping bag, took out the high-end underwear inside, and threw it directly in Susan's face. Shame on you, giving underwear to someone else's wife. You're so fucking disgusting. Emma finished speaking. She slapped Susan twice and then kicked her twice. Susan was kicked far away by Emma. Knowing she was in the wrong, she dared not resist and could only lower her head. All he wanted now was for the box of knockout pills to be stronger, so that he would faint directly. This way, he wouldn't see the villagers' contemptuous looks. I can no longer hear the villagers' mocking words. Just waited for a long, long time. Susan still didn't feel sleepy at all. Lu Dabiao, I'm going to kill you. You're a profiteer. You sold me fake medicine. Susan was heartbroken. It took nearly a month's salary. Bought a box of fake medicine. I couldn't faint at the critical moment. The villagers could only laugh at me. Susan had a safety tool in her mouth, high-end underwear hanging around her neck, covering her lower body, wearing black socks, and holding a biology test paper in her arms, walking with her head down. The surroundings were full of villagers, holding peanuts and melon seeds in their hands, watching crazily. Emma slapped Susan's forehead hard and pointed at the biology test paper in his arms. Don't just walk around, discuss literature and biology. Go. Don't hit me. I want to communicate. I want to discuss. Susan, dressed like this and holding the biology test paper, walked up to a female villager with great shame. Xiaomei, I want to discuss literature with you. Abnormal. With a slap, the female villager slapped Susan on the face. Susan grimaced in pain. Then he walked to a young couple and showed the biology test to the male villager. When the other female villager saw Su Shanshan, her face turned blue and purple. Xiaoyang, are you a biology student? I want to discuss some biological issues with you. Su Shanshan could finish her words. The male villager named Yang punched her in the face. I'm imitating your mother. You flirted with my wife in the factory, right? You're still discussing biology? What kind of biology? Are you discussing how our Yang family gave birth to a piece of trash like you? Susan was beaten so badly that her eyes were black and blue. Along the way, the families of the female workers whom he had bullied before started beating and kicking him. He regrets it now. Endless regret. He bothered with Johnson's wife for no reason. Matter how beautiful Grace is, or how good her figure is, no matter how pitiful, he shouldn't have provoked. Grace. She is the woman that Susan will never get. Regret. Suddenly, Susan walked and stopped, and was finally led home by Emma with a bruised face. Johnson still sat in the main seat with a cold expression. Michael, Tang Shushu, and a group of big men stood respectfully behind him. Susan knelt in front of Johnson as soon as she entered the door. Brother Johnson, I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Susan cried and lowered her head to admit her fault. But Johnson's eyes were full of murderous intent. Michael saw the murderous intent in Johnson's eyes, took out a knife, and stabbed Susan in the abdomen. Don't kill me. I apologize. I will apologize to Grace as well. Don't kill me. Just when the knife was about to stab into Susan's belly, Emma stopped it. Johnson looked at Emma coldly, and Emma motioned Johnson to go out for a while. Johnson nodded, and he and Emma walked out of the house and came to a small dirt slope. Johnson stood on the hill, looking towards home, towards Grace and Angela. There was endless pity in his eyes. Emma followed Johnson's gaze, and her eyes turned slightly red. Brother, the situation was urgent before, but I didn't tell you. Sister Grace cried, and cried very hard, not because of Susan, but because you were going to be listed as a typical case by the county. Sister Grace really loves you very much. I can feel it. She can't live without you. Johnson took a deep breath. I know. Emma glanced at Susan's house with endless disgust in her eyes. Brother, I hate Susan too and want to kill him. But have you ever thought about whether someone like Susan can be killed completely? Sister Grace is so beautiful. Even a woman like me thinks she is so beautiful. She is also so pure and kind. There will always be people like Susan around Sister Grace. You can never kill them all. After finishing speaking, Emma paused for a moment and continued. The reason why Sister Grace was fooled this time is that the county wants to make an example of you. It is better to save Susan's life and use Susan to convey a message to Sister Grace that the county will not make an example of me. This will eliminate the reason for Sister Grace to do something stupid for you, and there will be no such thing in the future. Johnson took a deep breath, pondered for a moment. Then Johnson looked into Emma's eyes. Was this your idea? Emma chuckled and stuck out her tongue. It wasn't my idea. It was Shushu's idea. But Shushu said it would be better if I said it, because I have a deeper relationship with Sister Grace. Shushu said that the matter of listing Susan as a typical example should be left to her. Johnson thought for a moment. Then he nodded and agreed to the proposal. Johnson and Emma then returned to Susan's home. Michael still had the knife in his hand against Susan's lower abdomen. Susan was so scared that she dared not move. If she moved a little, the knife would pierce into her flesh. Emma squatted in front of Susan and told him the only way to survive. Susan nodded desperately after listening. I agree. As long as you don't kill me. Anything is fine. I really know I was wrong. I can follow you to apologize to Grace right now. Johnson shook his head. Then she said calmly, then Grace will realize it's fake. In the evening, Grace will come over as usual, and you should do what Emma says. You should know what to say and what not to say. Yes, I know. Susan quickly responded. Johnson pondered for a moment and added coldly. Also, let Grace take the test questions home tonight. You withheld her salary, and you have to pay for her mental damages. You should pay back for the dirty things you did and apologize. If you don't want to live anymore, you can just keep it to yourself. The people I left at your house will come out and kill you. Yes, I dare not hide it. Susan was terribly frightened. He just asked now. Grace came over in the evening. Talk less to him. Chapter 33 Annie, please forgive me. Johnson arranged for people to work at Susan's home and outside. Then he drove from Susan's home. Before leaving, Emma said her father would bring people from the county to look for Johnson in the evening. Liu Yushan often comes to see Grace. Bring some dried sweet potatoes and cornmeal. See if there is anything to eat at home. See if Grace and Angela were beaten by Johnson. Johnson came home. Grace played with Angela at home, but Grace was in a bad mood. Her face was a little pale, and her body was cold. This situation continued until the evening. The later it got, the more nervous Grace became, and she even trembled. After Johnson prepared the meal, Grace prepared to go out without eating a few bites. Grace didn't know what would happen this time when she went to Susan's house. But I can't not go. Johnson just seems to have reformed a bit. The good days have just begun. She didn't want Johnson to be taken away as an example. My whole body was shaking. A deep feeling of helplessness lingered in her heart. Grace walked to the door, and Johnson was feeding Angela. At this time, Johnson carried Angela out to see Grace off. Angela was holding a chicken drumstick in her hand. Johnson, I'm going to my colleague's house to look over some questions. I'll be back soon. If it's too late, you guys should go to bed first. Grace bit her lips tightly, her face pale. Johnson took a deep breath when he saw Grace like this. Then he hugged Angela and nodded. Don't be too late. If you can't finish it, just bring it back and read it. Grace showed a hint of bitterness at the corner of her mouth. Shaked his head. The test questions were issued by the county. How can you just bring it back? Angela took a bite of the chicken leg and said cutely, Come on, Mom. Dad and I are waiting for you at home. Grace forced a smile and nodded. Well, I'll go then. Grace left home. She collapsed and walked to Susan's house in a daze. Grace's face was extremely pale, and she was shaking. She didn't know what would happen when she entered. Grace gritted her teeth and knocked on the door. As Grace knocked on the door, there was a commotion in Susan's house. Susan heard Grace knocking on the door. Her face turned equally pale. Johnson's men in the kitchen and bedroom, staring at him with knives. There were also Johnson's men outside the house. A little carelessness. Susan has to explain herself here. Susan walked to the door and opened it for Grace. Grace looked so pitiful, with her incomparable appearance and stunning figure that made Susan's blood boil again, even though the drug had not yet worn off. But the first words Grace said after opening the door almost scared Susan to death. Director Yang? That high-end underwear can't be found. I didn't wear it. Grace said embarrassedly. How much is that high-end underwear? I'll save up money to compensate you. Susan was frightened to death. He could feel that the people in the room were sharpening their knives. He quickly glossed over the underwear issue. It's not worth much. It's okay. It's best if I lose it. It's best if I lose it. Susan was just about to let Grace take the test and leave, but Grace's next move made Susan's face turn pale. Grace walked into the room and sat down on a chair. Director Young, as long as I chat with you, you won't report Johnson, right? Then let's chat. I'll chat with you for a while. Susan was overwhelmed. He used to think that it was a good thing for a woman to be too simple. And now, he just felt terrible. This Grace is horrible. Susan had no choice but to sit on the stool opposite Grace, with the test questions on the table. Susan's face was much uglier than Grace's. The effect of the drug had not yet worn off. He covered his lower body and was extremely nervous. He felt that Johnson's men would rush out of the room at any time and stab him to death like a rubber ball. Grace's next words made Susan completely collapse. Judithorian? I don't know what to talk about. Didn't you say you didn't know how to do a biology question? Which one? I remember you said it was about the structure of the human body. Come over here, and I'll explain it to you. Plop. Susan fell to her knees in front of Grace. Annie, please forgive me. I've already knelt down for you. Isn't that enough? Stop talking now, or I'll be dead. No way. Susan couldn't bear it any longer. This Grace is amazing. Let Grace continue. He must die here today. Susan took out a bag of adult products from the broken kitchen cabinet and placed the contents on the floor. 2 pairs of socks, a safety toolbox, a Viagra box, and a knockout drug box. Grace's face turned pale when she saw these. Director Young, what are you going to do? Grace frowned. Susan knelt on the ground and waved her hands quickly. I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing anything. This box is empty. Even so, Grace ran to the door very vigilantly, ready to escape at any time. At this time, Susan also told Grace what he was going to do with these things. Grace looked at Susan in shock. It never occurred to her that Susan wanted to do this. Grace had thought it through when she came. If Susan really used Johnson's matter to threaten her, the most she would accept is Susan touching her hand. As for doing that, she didn't even think about that. Grace stood in front of the door. The moonlight poured in, showing Grace's perfect face and figure. The effect of Viagra on Susan's body had not yet worn off, but she could only look at it but not eat it, which was very uncomfortable. Susan was almost dying of pain. Grace, don't you think about it? A man invites you to his home at night. Is it just to chat and study? That's all lies. It's all a lie. It's all for you. Grace shook her head in disbelief. How could this happen? Didn't you take care of me and Angela at the factory? Susan was still kneeling on the ground. He didn't dare to look up at Grace. Grace looked like a fairy in the sky at this moment. I usually take care of you for the same reason, all for the sake of getting you. Not only you, I also take care of other female workers for the same purpose. Grace frowned and looked at Susan angrily. Before Grace could speak, Susan continued to confess. Grace, I was the one who secretly messed with her during that blind date in the early years.